the complex and growing threats facing our nation. Today, we're going to review the state of the defense industrial base and how we can best position it to fully support our military if conflict breaks out. For over 200 years, we have relied on the skills of the men and women working in shipyards, factories throughout America to build the tools of warfighters that warfighters need to succeed in battle. We cannot prevail in any conflict without a ready, strong, and adaptable industrial base. But over the last 30 years, we have watched the industrial base atrophy. Defense firms have consolidated, supply chains have narrowed, regulatory burdens have grown out of control, and recruitment and retention of the skilled workforce have become much more difficult. The consequences are readily apparent. Critical acquisition programs are years behind schedule and way over budget. Thousands of small businesses are choosing not to do business with the Pentagon. And we are losing war game after war game because we can't resupply critical munitions and weapon systems in a timely manner. While recent NDAs have made great strides in tackling this issue, much more needs to be done. We need to expand multi-year contracts and fully fund them to provide industry with more certainty. We need to bulldoze the labyrinth of regulatory burdens that hamstring the acquisition process. We need to end our dependency on China for critical minerals and materials. And we need to reform the arms export process to help industry work with our allies and partners to unlock greater burden sharing. Ultimately, however, we need to invest much more in workforce development, automation, and infrastructure improvements. While our adversaries increase investments and subsidies in their defense industrial bases, we've let ours languish. A strong, resilient, and diverse industrial base is needed to restore peace through strength. Our adversaries will only be deterred if they know that the United States, along with its allies, can produce and sustain military forces in a protracted conflict. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about what resources and authorities your member companies need to revitalize the industrial base and restore American deterrence. With that, I yield to my friend, the ranking member, for any comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this hearing. I think this is an important topic that we should all discuss as we get ready to see what the budget is going to look like. Yes, our ability to get to scale and produce what we need to produce in the quantity it needs to produce is seriously in question. Whether you're talking about shipbuilding, munitions, across the board, there are considerable concerns about our ability to build what we need to build. I completely agree with your comments about the workforce. We need to do a better job of developing that workforce as we go forward and to get to that scale of production on critical items. Another big part of it, which I know this committee has done a lot of work on, is how quickly we make decisions and are able to adapt to new technologies and buy new equipment. The process is too slow. We all know that. We've talked about that repeatedly. The Pentagon is more focused on process, less focused on results. The defense industrial base is focused on sort of gaming the requirement system to make sure that they win, and we don't make decisions quickly. And Congress, of course, limits the flexibility of the Pentagon to get there. The other aspect of this, though, that I hope we'll consider is choices. When you look at all of the areas within DOD where we want to spend more money, and you can pick a member here who has a particular interest. If you're from a shipbuilding area, you will complain that we don't have enough ships. We talk about our jet fighters. We don't have the F-35 fast enough. And then when you look at all of the adversaries that we face and what our concerns are with China, with Russia, I think that's still a concern, with the Middle East, with various terrorist groups. And you say, well, what do we need to meet those threats? The one thing I hope everyone considers here, we cannot possibly spend the amount of money and build what is needed to meet all of the threats that we keep talking about. It's simply not possible. So part of this needs to be thinking about what is our strategy? How do we manage the challenges that we face instead of imagining that we're somehow going to be dominant in the world and be able to deter everybody? We are not making choices in terms of what is a realistic defense strategy. We're not going to be able to dominate and overcome every single perceived adversary out there. So I hope we have some conversation this year about how we can restructure that and make different choices. And one key part of that is something that the chairman mentioned, allies and partners. They're going to be absolutely crucial. Now, in this particular context, they're crucial in terms of the industrial base. Allies and partners have capabilities. That's why I'm such a huge fan of AUKUS. You know, building that greater partnership with the UK and Australia. Yes, you know, we'll build submarines, but also the technology sharing that goes into that enables us to rely on other parts of the world, other partners and allies. Now, it's important to have partners and allies who are willing to do that, so we can't go around offending all of them all the time. But we're going to need those partners and allies to do that. The last thing that I'd like to hear from our witnesses about is the impact of the DOGE approach to the Pentagon. I am concerned about that. To begin with, we need skilled workers. And now we are apparently going to add the Pentagon to the list of federal agencies where we're simply going to randomly fire people. Okay? Now, we're not going in there and saying who's good at their job, we need this particular talent, we need that particular talent. At the moment, we're just saying that we're going to fire the people who have been there for less than 2 years. I mean, that's not quality control. That can enter chaos into the process in a very unhelpful way. It's also become apparent that a lot of people are going to be fired based on their loyalty to the president as opposed to their ability. And trust me, that lesson will be learned by people at the Pentagon. And they will learn, okay, I don't have to be good at my job, I just have to suck up to the boss. And they will make that choice. That's not going to make us better, it's not going to make us more efficient or more effective. And lastly, any insights anyone might have on the proposed 8% cuts. Supposedly it's going to be cut, you know, from certain areas, I don't know where, and then added back into, quote, presidential priorities. But the clarity on that process just isn't there. I mean, nobody seems to know exactly what the point of that is, and yet we're talking about 8% of the budget that's going to be moved around. A little bit of clarity on this is what we're looking for, this is where it needs to go would help. So chaos is not going to help this process. I think we have 3 very, very highly qualified witnesses here today. Look forward to hearing from you about how we can be more efficient, more effective, and build what we need to meet our national security objectives. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank the ranking member. Before we continue with the introduction of the witnesses, I want to remind those in the audience that this hearing is open to the public, but that actions to disrupt or distract will not be tolerated. The chair reserves the right to remove disruptive persons from the hearing. U.S. Capitol Police are on hand to assist with that task, and I thank them for their presence. Let me start by introducing the Honorable Eric Fanning. He's the President and CEO of the Aerospace Industries Association, former HASS staffer. He served, which is what qualified him, by the way. He served as the 22nd Secretary of the Army and various other senior roles in his 25 years of government service. The Honorable David Norquist is the President and CEO of the National Defense Industrial Association. Mr. Norquist previously served as the 34th Deputy Secretary of Defense from 2019 to 21. And Max Paxton is the President of the Shipbuilders Council of America, a role he assumed in 2007 after a very distinguished career as a senior advisor in the Senate. With that, Mr. Fanning, we'll start with you. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my time.
You need to turn your microphone on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time on the HASC staff was.
I don't think your microphone's working. Maybe pull it closer to you, Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There we go. My time on the HASC staff was well before anybody on the committee was on the committee. Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the importance of strengthening the United States industrial base. Every morning, more than 2 million Americans employed by the aerospace and defense industry go to work with one mission in mind: to enhance deterrence by increasing the lethality, survivability, and chance of victory for the warfighter. This is our industry's primary driver: to make our country safer, more secure, and more prosperous. To do this, the companies that make up the defense industrial base rely on clear demand signals from Congress and the executive branch, sufficient federal investment, a healthy and resilient supply chain, and a regulatory environment that promotes both innovation and adoption. The last 3 years have exposed how many years of policy and funding have shaped the contours of our industry. We invest for peace rather than the deterrence necessary to sustain that peace. We optimize for efficiency rather than capacity. This was true when I testified 2 years ago before this committee, and it remains true today. Despite an incredible amount of attention to the matter, including from this committee, and industry working against enormous economic headwinds to change this, we still have a system that increasingly can't keep pace. However we proceed, we must take an all-of-the-above approach to defense acquisition, recognizing that the defense industrial base is a diverse ecosystem of companies that each have an important role to play. We must ensure the system positions the whole industrial base, primes, new entrants, suppliers, and commercial companies of all sizes, to meet the warfighter's needs and the nation's expectations. We can start with the complex maze of well-meaning but burdensome statutes and government policies, which drive up the cost and complexities of doing business with the federal government. Bureaucracies are additive. We create a process to prevent the last bad thing from happening again, well-intentioned and important. But the cumulative effect of this risk mitigation has become a greater risk than the combined mitigation because it's keeping new equipment from getting to the warfighter. Today, it takes nearly 300 days on average to award prime contracts with estimated sales of more than $100 million. For commercial companies used to working quickly, the delays in awarding contracts and executing agreements are a strong disincentive to contracting with the DoD. And small businesses struggle to maintain the cash flow over such a long horizon. Congress should focus on right-sizing the regulatory regime to encourage new entrants and support companies of all sizes within the DIB. The removal of regulatory burdens also applies to strengthening domestic manufacturing and supply chains, as well as for allowing closer cooperation with allies and trusted partners. These global alliances are a competitive advantage for the United States, and we make it too hard for them to work with us and buy the equipment they want, ours. Increasing domestic manufacturing and supply chain resiliency, easing technology sharing requirements, and growing our defense exports are key to a U.S. posture that effectively deters our adversaries. Rationalizing the process for arms sales has the added benefit of creating additional funding streams for the DIB. In the 2024 fiscal year, total foreign arms sales exceeded all DoD procurement and RDT&E accounts combined, a necessary lifeline amid an uncertain funding environment. And federal investment must keep pace with the threats we face. While we all recognize the growing instability around the world, particularly growing threats from China, our actions have not matched our words. Insufficient funding levels, the annual reliance on short-term funding measures, and the constant specter of government shutdowns have created deep-seated and disrupting instability for companies. This, in turn, jeopardizes our ability to maintain production lines, support a skilled workforce, and develop innovative new technologies that ensure our asymmetric advantage. Lastly, guaranteeing the DIB has access to the talent pipeline to sustain its work is foundational to these efforts. Investing in STEM education, reskilling current industry employees for new technologies, and enhancing our country's training efforts, including apprenticeship programs, on-the-job training, and certification and credentialing programs, are vital to ensuring a highly skilled, dynamic future workforce. The administration and this Congress are pursuing a policy of peace through strength. The United States defense industrial base delivers that strength. The nation needs and deserves the entire defense industrial base running at full steam. On behalf of the Aerospace Industries Association, thank you again for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Fanning. Mr. Norquist, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, and I'll bring it up closer. There we go. Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today on strengthening America's defense industrial base, which is essential for our national security. I will limit myself to brief opening remarks. For a more detailed analysis, the National Defense Industrial Association has just completed a report on the resilience of the U.S. defense industrial base titled Vital Signs 2025. And with the Chair's permission, I submit that report for the record. For over 100 years, NDIA has provided a forum for government and industry leaders to collaborate and address complex defense issues so that our nation maintains a strong and resilient defense industrial base. NDIA and its affiliates represent over 1,700 defense companies of all sizes and sectors, and the majority are small businesses. These companies design, manufacture, and maintain the cutting-edge technologies and systems that our armed forces rely upon to defend our nation. During the last 35 years, government policy and funding decisions have resourced the U.S. defense industrial base for low-intensity conflict. Critical elements of the industrial base, including the manufacturing sector, skilled trade workforce, have atrophied. Industry behavior reflected the funding levels and the rules set by its customer, the federal government. But now the threat has changed. If we want increased capacity, speed, resilience, and innovation, then we must prioritize them in the budget, acquisition, and requirements process. At a high level, many of the issues facing the U.S. defense industrial base are well known. Sclerotic acquisition process, brittle supply chains, insufficient procurement funding, unstable budgets, increased regulation, and barriers to modernizing defense trade. The committee has been a leader in addressing these challenges. What makes change hard is that the system is so complex that changes at one level is often offset by counter-pressures at another level. For example, we must be aware of how statutes, regulations, and policies driving compliance decisions at the program manager and contracting officer level can create incentives counter to the intent of reforms from Congress or senior department leaders. One concrete example is how current policies and regulations deter industry ramping up munitions production, and I look forward to engaging with you on this topic. Likewise, new restrictions and barriers to entry are rising, including specific challenges around intellectual property and data rights, as well as the cyber security maturity model certification requirements. While well-intentioned and in many cases very important, both of these are clear areas that discourage attracting new entrants, suppress innovation, and increase compliance costs. In addition, as the Congress moves forward to reduce regulatory burdens and incentivize novel contracting approaches to attract and retain new companies, it is important to give traditional company contractors access to the same streamlined system. Otherwise, we are signaling to the non-traditionals that as they succeed, they will eventually graduate into the current, slow, burdensome, and costly system. This Congress and the new administration have inherited the political conditions conducive to breaking up and reforming an acquisition system that prioritizes reducing risk over speed and innovation. The good news, our nation has a defense sector that is innovative and dynamic. What is required is to shape the conditions that will allow it to perform in the way we want. NDI appreciates the committee's leadership and focus on this strategic topic. We look forward to working with you to rebuild our defense industrial base in order to strengthen our national security. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Norquist. Mr. Paxton, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Your microphone's not on. Just see if the staff can get that working.
Nope. Thank you.
There you go.
On behalf of the Shipbuilders Council of America, I'd like to thank Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Smith and members of the committee for the opportunity to provide testimony on strengthening the U.S. defense industrial base. Since I last testified before this committee, there have been questions from senior Navy leaders and others as to whether the U.S. shipyard industrial base has the capacity and capability to build and maintain our Navy and Coast Guard fleets. I want to state very clearly that the physical capacity of our shipyards is not a constraint to building and maintaining the fleet. In fact, industry capacity is a reflection of the demand signal of our government and commercial customers. And in ship counts, that demand signal for several decades was on the lower end. On top of this, we went through sequestration, strategic pauses in certain programs, and endured the general volatility resulting from ever-changing or non-existent shipbuilding plans. Considering all of these factors, it is no wonder the private industry moves cautiously with capital expenditures and investment in workforce. I'm here this morning to thank the work of this committee and Congress for implementing policies and laws to assist the defense industrial base. But certainly more will need to be done to truly achieve the innovation and efficiencies needed to deliver, with speed, critical defense programs to our men and women in uniform. In particular, to strengthen the shipyard industrial base, we must be committed to maximizing optimization of existing private industry shipyard capacity, relentlessly seeking to reduce excessive oversight and requirements, and end the sole focus on competition at the expense of partnership. It is undeniable that there has been a reduction in fleet size since the end of the Cold War. The government customer has gotten more bureaucratic and risk-averse. Navy got out of shipbuilding role in 1971 when they determined private industry was producing ships 20% cheaper. Over time, Navy's oversight and bureaucratic reach stymied innovation and has slowed the industry rather than sped it up. Anecdotally, I can see this on the ground. For example, I was recently in the shipyard where the ratio of shipyard workers to government oversight was 16-1. And in another smaller shipyard had a 2-1 ratio. In any objective view, this is simply not efficient and overly burdensome, resulting in bureaucratic breakdowns impacting schedule and cost. Shipyards invest significant efforts in preparing designs, conducting extensive feasibility assessments, and shaping workforce plans based on initial requirements. Even when a company wins the contract, they're still dealing with shifting requirements after contract award, pushing even more cost burden onto shipbuilders while adding delays and inefficiencies. Sailors deserve the best we can offer. However, we are over-designing platforms to the point that they are not able to be manufactured, and thus sailors are asked to perform on older vessels with less capabilities. There must be some level of mission sufficient when it comes to design. Additionally, Navy ship repair has been scrutinized in the headlines, with some going as far as to suggest that we should outsource our critical maintenance availabilities to international counterparts. Outsourcing would only exacerbate the decreasing workloads in the domestic private ship repair market. Instead, we need to address the fundamental issues impacting ship repair, including increased complexity of work, available materials, and how to facilitate a reduced regulatory structure. Lastly, I'd note the current prospect that we are facing a year-long continuing resolution is agonizing to industry. It is paramount that Congress does its part and returns to passing regular appropriation bills on time before the end of each fiscal year. SEA would encourage the Congress to continue to support stable, realistic, and predictable budgets for the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard, and we appreciate the work of this committee has done to see these goals realized. Ultimately, we need to change the behavior as we're currently in an adversarial environment in contracting and design, which is a lose-lose for industry and Navy. We must return to a partnering model where the government, customer, and industry focus on continuous process improvement and joint ownership of problem resolution. We need to view industry and Navy and the Coast Guard as partners and share equally in the risks with the common goal of delivering quality ships on time and on budget. Thank you, Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Smith, for allowing me to testify with such distinguished witnesses, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Paxton. I thank all the witnesses for their time they put into making those statements and preparing for this hearing, and I do appreciate your attendance and participation. I recognize myself first for 5 minutes. Start with you, Mr. Paxton. Tell me what the shipbuilding industry's done to strengthen its supply base. I understand I'm hearing all kind of horror stories about supply chain problems that have really been exacerbated since the COVID pandemic, but tell me what you're doing to make sure that your supply chain is not a problem.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. First, I'll say our shipyards are constantly taking the pulse of the health of our supply chain. It's absolutely critical that we know where our sole source suppliers are and what the health of our industrial base looks like. We are investing in the supply chain. We are grateful for the work that this committee has done, and the Congress has appropriated money for the submarine industrial base and the maritime industrial base. Those initiatives are having a real positive impact on the supplier base. But overall, you're correct, Chairman. Since COVID and before COVID, quite frankly, there was a consolidation in the supplier base, and we need to maintain the resiliency and health of that supply chain.
Well, Mr. Norquist, you talked about how current policies and regulations are making it harder for industry to ramp up munitions production. We've seen as a result of the conflict in Eastern Europe that our ability to produce munitions has really atrophied. How can we fix this?
So there's a number of challenges that happen with munitions. The first is it swings more than the top line in the budget. When the budget gets tight, often the department will ask for amounts only necessary to keep a facility open and running. And so you see this unstable demand signal that happens on the munitions. So that's one of the challenges. I think also if you look at certainly the unclassified war games, but this committee may have access to classified ones, to ask the question whether the floor that we're building to in peacetime is in fact the appropriate inventory of munitions we should have versus the requirement. There's an assumption that once the war starts, all of a sudden things will be available that weren't before. I think there's a risk to that, certainly when the other team can attack. There's also rules about when you have a profile for munition that shows a drop-off at the end. It discourages someone from opening a second production line, because by the time you bring in trained workers, by the time you get it up and running, you'll turn around and have the production drop. And so trying to rationalize the quantities you're buying with what you want the company to do in terms of factories. Those would be sort of the three things I'd start with.
Great. Mr. Fanning, you and I talked in my office yesterday about the effect of CRs on cash flow and how that's affecting companies in the supply chain. Would you share with the committee today your thoughts on what these CRs are meaning in just the actual operational abilities of supply chain companies?
Well, it's certainly we've lived with CRs for many years, although we're much further into the fiscal year now than we typically are with a CR. And it's happening at a time when I think the supply chain, at least for our companies and our supply chain members, are stretched thin and as fragile as we've seen in a very long time. And a lot of that has to do with cash flow, following and being in an inflationary period. There's a lag for inflation in the industrial base, and I would argue that the Pentagon still hasn't seen the full impacts of inflation. So you have companies in supply chain with really stretched cash flow problems, causing them to have to move CapEx money into working account funds just to keep payroll going. And when there's a CR and payments are cut off or are delayed, it creates that extra stress and burden for the companies inside the supply chain that may have already lined up their workforce, their materials, their parts, and are under obligation to those contracts, but aren't seeing their work start on something new or continue on something they're working on.
Yeah, and I just want people to understand, if you're a small business in these supply chains, it becomes very unappealing to stay in this world and work for the Defense Department, and you decide instead just to go to the commercial work area. So this is something that we're creating with these CRs, and we've got to stop it. With that, thank you, gentlemen, and I yield to the ranking member for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Norquist, you were talking a little bit about our capacity to grow quickly. And that's sort of a bit of the trap we're in. It's the whole demand signal thing. Industry obviously would like us to say, for the next 10 years, we're going to buy maximum amount of these things. But it's a rapidly changing environment, so we don't know for sure. And the answer to that would be build surge capacity. So that you could, is there any way to do that better than we've done it currently, or is it just the case that given how complicated it is to make systems, they do better to get there?
So the answer first is it is really difficult, because to bring in surge is to bring in, the time you train and equip people. But we also don't ask for it in our contracting. So typically, if you have two bidders and one builds excess capacity, they will bid a higher price and lose. And so unless you ask for that as part of the requirement, the same thing with two suppliers. If you don't ask for two suppliers coming into a supply chain for that final product, then you'll get the bidder will be the one who does the single source. The things you can do, for example, is typically these are unused capacity is frowned on in the pricing, in audits, and in the allowable costs. So if you want somebody to have a capacity to surge, then they need to have it priced into the contract or treated as an allowable cost. But you want to be careful where you do that. You only want to do that in the things you're trying to allow, because it is an extra cost for the system. So as you point out, you can't have everything. You need to figure out which are the systems, which are the items that when the war starts or before the war starts, you will need to surge, and how do you provide the rules for those contracts and those items to allow for surge capacity.
Well, and that's something I really think that the DOD and this body needs to do, is make better choices about that. We're all in favor of everything. If everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. And I think we need to really focus on that. It seems to me that, drones, missiles, counter-drone, missile defense are high priorities. And yet we're funding a whole bunch of other things. So I think some choices need to be made. Mr. Fanning, you were talking about the slow pace of contracts, and I'm with you. We could go through any number of different stories. I mean, the jitters radio, God help us, the tanker. I mean, that was when it was like 2004, I think, when we first said that, maybe 2003. We still don't actually have the functional tanker. What can we do to speed up contracting?
Well, I don't think there's unfortunately any silver bullet to this.
Yeah.
I think the entire
Give me a
process.
brass bullet.
Yeah.
You know, just
The
a
entire
little something.
process from end to end, needs to be rationalized. As I said before, what we see in bureaucracies is sort of a steering by the wake attitude, and processes are important, and you want to prevent bad things from happening. But it just adds to the slow nature of the contracting. I think we're at a time where we need to add some thoughtful risk back into the system in order to get speed. And there are ways to do that. It requires careful oversight to make sure that the risk was well placed. But I think that's a larger cultural issue of taking risk to move faster. And I don't think that's what we reward in the system. It's not what we train for in the system. Anytime you ask Congress for more authorities, you get the answer, we just gave you authorities, which is almost always true. There are always authorities that aren't being utilized because we don't incentivize the federal workforce to use that. We incentivize them to find the problems, not necessarily get us past the problems.
Well, and
it's not just DOD,
yeah.
by the way. I mean, we see this in certification and FAA, and it's not, in my view, the workforce. I've worked with amazing people in the federal workforce. They are rewarded when they catch the problems, and we need to think about that. And we can target it to specific sectors of what we're trying to produce in DOD. To experiment with that and pilot it, but I think we really need to train those workers, that workforce, differently, and incentivize them and reward them for taking that risk and getting things to the warfighter faster.
Now, take my last 30 seconds here just to restate an editorial comment about the DOGE effort and how we are going in there. It's what's so maddening about this is if you were to go in there and say, we want to make the changes in the workforce that you just described, just set the incentives differently. The DOD workforce does a pretty good job of what we're telling them to do, okay? And we're telling them to go through a lot of process and make sure you never make a mistake. So rather than going in there and just randomly firing people, set a different culture. Change the requirements process. Free them up so they can do their job. And it's really frustrating because I know what Elon Musk did at SpaceX. I know he knows better than this. So I just don't know what the hell's going on. Well, I have a suspicion, which I'm not going to get into at the moment, but it's a huge missed opportunity to actually make the workforce at the Pentagon better, more efficient. I know people who work at the Pentagon, they're as frustrated as we are, okay? They don't like the requirements that we put on them. They don't like the process that we force them to go through. They're smart, capable people who shouldn't be being treated like this. We should use them as the asset they are and unleash that asset. So I hope we will change our approach on that going forward. Thank you for the indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And indeed, Secretary Fanning, we're glad to have you back. We appreciate your heritage, and we appreciate all of you for being here today. It's so important that we have our country prepared for peace through strength, and that's what you're doing. With that in mind, I'm really grateful. I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, and so I particularly appreciate the naval facilities that are located there and have been so important. And to me, I was a Sea Cadet, but most important, I appreciate the Navy. My number 2 son, Ad, is an orthopedic surgeon, Beaufort Naval Hospital, previously Naples, Italy. So it's just, the Navy is just so important. With that in mind, Mr. Paxton, you've mentioned that in your written testimony, the Navy's addition of last-minute specification changes to parent designs, along with the unilateral design changes that the contract is awarded, is creating difficulty for shipbuilders to meet the government's requirements without massive cost overruns. How can we implement long-term contracts to provide predictability for defense contractors while also having room for the Navy to make changes to respond to constantly changing global threats, as we've seen with war criminal Putin invading Ukraine and the puppets of Tehran invading Israel?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. And Denton's Shipyard, which is in
You
Charleston,
need to
South
get your
Carolina-
microphone on.
I'm sorry.
There
Again,
you
I
go.
apologize. Denton's Shipyard is a member of the Shipbuilders Council of America, and they're right there in Charleston, sir.
Here, here.
You know, what we've experienced with some of our shipbuilding programs that are not in the tier 1 shipyards, talking about surface combatants and aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines, what we see on some of the lower programs, the auxiliary programs, there's a constant churn on design. We go out with an RFP, it's one price, and the shipyards bid on this, and what they bid on ultimately is redesigned and added ship specifications and requirements that by the time they ultimately are going to build this thing, there's a different price and the vessel costs dramatically more. So we got to lock those designs in, basic functional design, and go forward with the shipbuilder and the government customer working together to get it right.
Well, we look forward to everyone working together on that. Additionally, our surface ships are entering maintenance in domestic shipyards are continuing subject to delays, resulting in a negative impact on readiness in the Indo-Pacific. Our Department of Defense partners are telling us it's a result of workforce limitations and supply chain issues when acquiring parts. Would you say that this is an accurate representation of the reason for the delays in domestic shipyards? And would this be the same for foreign shipyards? But I am very grateful that I visited, of course, the Guam shipyard and our tremendous territory in the middle of the Pacific that is so crucial. And in visiting, I saw how dedicated they were. So what is the status?
Yes, sir. Workforce is the number one challenge facing the shipyard industrial base at this point in time, both in shipbuilding and in ship repair. So workforce is a challenge. Coming out of COVID, what we did see was kind of a generational shift with the aging of our workforce, with a lot of our experienced shipyard workers just retiring out of the industry post-COVID. So whereas in the mid-1990s, a supervisor might have had 20 years experience, sir, some of those supervisors have 4.5 years. So there is a greening of the workforce. But I can tell you this, our shipyard industry is investing the money and the resources to ramp that workforce back up. As for foreign shipyards, sir, they're facing similar challenges with their workforces as well. And it's our number one priority to get it right.
And indeed, the Republic of Korea, to me, is so important, and what an opportunity, and with the backup at the Guam shipyard. Mr. Norquist, you've stated that many issues about defense industrial base are being faced, and we see with war criminal Putin invading Ukraine and the attacks on Israel by the regime in Tehran and its puppets, that we have difficulty refilling our stockpiles. What is the status of a defense contractor to be able to increase production or shift from commercial production to military production?
Apologize. So you have two challenges there. The second one you mentioned is commercial moving towards working for the Department of Defense. There, the challenge is the number of unusual requirements that DoD puts on a company as you enter this, which really requires them to go all in order to be able to make it work. On the first one, which is ramping up, the key question is access to capital to be able to invest in additional facilities. The supply chain, in some cases, when we're ramping up one munition, it uses the same solid rocket motor line that 2 other munitions use, so they end up getting stuck. And then the third one was mentioned before, is the training of the workforce. These are very skilled individuals that are doing this work, and this is not something you can pick up overnight. So making sure that we have that pipeline of capacity to be able to provide those skilled workers for those functions.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Chair, I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, thank you for this very, very important first hearing of the full committee. We're dealing with profoundly important issues here. I want to focus on the maritime industry writ large. I want to thank our former member, Mike Walsh, who spent a lot of time as chairman of the Readiness Committee addressing the issue of the capacity of the United States to provide both naval vessels as well as commercial vessels. And now Mr. Trent Kelly, who has picked up this issue. The introduction last year of the Ships for America Act is the most comprehensive piece of legislation in recent history, perhaps in all history, about how we can address the maritime challenges that face this nation, both in the naval issues as well as the commercial. I draw the attention of the committee to that. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for raising this in your opening remarks. And I want to basically ask the witnesses their view of the Ships for America Act as it applies to those members of their organizations. So let's start with Mr. Paxton.
Thank you, Congressman Garamendi.
Microphone, please.
Thank you, Congressman Garamendi. And first of all, thank you for your leadership, sir, on the Energizing America Shipbuilding Act, which is part of the SHIPS Act. And thank you for your sponsorship of the SHIPS Act. Not since the 1970s, 1970 Merchant Marine Act have we seen a peacetime buildup that the SHIPS Act would portend if we were to pass that legislation. Having a national maritime strategy is a failure. We should have a national maritime strategy that stitches together the commercial industrial base with our Navy, with our Coast Guard, with our Merchant Marine, and the SHIPS Act does all of those things. And again, it really begs the question of, do we want to be in international commerce? Do we want to have a global logistics arm with our U.S.-built, U.S.-flagged, U.S.-crewed ships? And I think the answer is yes.
Thank you.
So I think one of the important things about the SHIP Act is it creates a framework for significantly enhancing the domestic shipbuilding and the repair. And one of the important things is, as we look at these challenges, many of them are industry specific. The type of changes you would make to increase and work through the shipyard industry might be very different than some of the others. So I think when you have such a complicated process, putting that focus there is particularly valuable. And I think the benefits for the maritime workforce, which is an essential part of the success of that industry, is key.
Thank you. Mr.
Thank you. I don't have a whole lot to add there other than maybe I can just foot stomp on the workforce issue. It's a highly skilled issue. In the shipyards, the conditions are a lot harder than other parts of aerospace and defense industry, and I think we have to address the labor rates that are allowable, particularly in shipyards.
Thank you. This piece of legislation is bicameral. Mark Kelly and Todd Young on the Senate side are the authors of it. We intend to reintroduce the bill following the chaos of March. And so we'll pick it up probably in April and reintroduce. Between now and then, any issues, concerns, suggestions that any of your members would want to make to improve or modify the bill, please let us know. I want to pick up another subject which came up, and it's the subject of investment. It's become increasingly clear that free cash flow from the major military industrial companies is not being used for training workers. Instead, it's being used to buy back stock. I think this is a major issue that we should pay attention to. And I would ask all three of you to identify the three largest organizations three largest companies in your organization and provide to me and the committee if those companies are using free cash flow within their company to buy back stocks or investing in the training of workers. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today. We know how important our shipbuilding capacity is, both the industrial base and the repair sector. That's going to be the key for us going forward. We know that we have a advantage in the undersea world. We know that that advantage comes from our Virginia-class submarines and also pending construction of the Columbia-class submarine. Unfortunately, last year we saw a president's budget that came over wanting to build one submarine, so we're retiring submarines at a faster rate than we're building them. Listen, folks, I'm not a mathematician, but I find it hard to figure out how we do addition by subtraction. When you're proposing to retire more ships than you're building, that's not a good path. We know that China has 232 times the shipbuilding capacity that the United States does, and they are using it today. The one place we do have that advantage is in the undersea world. We have to get back to building 2.33 Virginia-class submarines a year to meet U.S. requirements and the requirements under AUKUS. We're not anywhere close there. We have to make sure we get our workforce back underway. That's an issue that needs to be taken up immediately. You know, how do we reconstitute that workforce? We understand what happened post-COVID. We haven't recovered the way we need to. I tell folks the top 3 issues in reconstituting our shipbuilding capacity and ship repair capacity, top 3 issues are workforce, workforce, and workforce. That's the key. Mr. Paxton, I wanted to ask you, what impact does the demand signal, that is the President's budget, the outcome of the National Defense Authorization Act, what impact does that have on what the industry looks towards investing in, and what does that do in trying to develop the workforce in order to have what's necessary, not just now, but in the future?
Yes, thank you, Congressman Whitman. As you know, sir, better than most, demand signal is the biggest factor in providing that predictability and the sustainability to do 2 things. We're obviously cap intensive, so we need to invest in our facilities and invest in our workforce. So having that demand signal is critical. I would also say, sir, we do need that long-term target to go towards. And having multiple or no shipbuilding plans is difficult. We should have a plan to shoot towards, and that does provide a demand signal that helps industry plan.
Yes, we know that long-term certainty is really the key in that effort. I wanted to get the panel's perspective on how do we do the 2 critical things to make sure that we're able to increase the pace and get closer to the capacity and capability that we need. First of all is, how do we decrease build times? Unfortunately, what we see is build times and also, for that matter, repair times going up, maintenance avails lasting longer. And how do we reduce costs? We have to do both of those, because in order to prevail here, we have to get more per our dollar than the Chinese get per their yuan, and we have to increase the pace. If they can build ships at a pace of 1 to 232, we've got a long ways to go in a short time to get there. So I'll go to Mr. Norquist, Mr. Fanning, and then Mr. Paxton.
So let me take that on in 2 parts. First, to get to what you stated in the opening. When you look at the challenge as you turn to the Pacific and the Chinese anti-access environment, undersea warfare becomes the unending demand signal. It can get inside. It creates a strategic advantage for the U.S. So the need for the U.S. for this is unambiguous. The challenge is converting that into the demand signals for industry that both causes them to be able to attract the workforce that they need, as well as to expand the supply chain so there aren't delays from disruptions. One of the things that I have seen is the Navy working with local communities on welding and others to try and create a pipeline. It's something that perhaps on airplanes and Air Force and others should look to copy. But as you point out, that workforce piece is such a big part of it, and then the step down from that is the suppliers. Those are the things that I think help drive up the speed, but I defer to my colleagues for other insights.
All right. Mr. Fanning?
I'd say I want to build on that. The shipbuilding industrial base that the Navy's investing in around the country, finding areas where there are concentrated pockets in the shipbuilding industry, has been very successful, looking for new entrants into the supply chain, investing in them, helping them with tooling. That's a model that I think we can probably extend across the defense industrial base. The second thing I would say on cost is making sure we're managing and keeping consistent the requirements. That adds a lot of cost, and it gets more costly as you continue to mix with the program. Third is just a reminder to everybody that the government investment in buying something is leveraged by a lot of private capital coming into the system, and it needs that consistent demand signal that CRs and shutdowns don't provide.
Very good. Thank you. I'm out of time, so I will yield the balance of my time, what is not left, back to the chairman.
Hear, 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 hear. Thank you, Congressman Rob Whitman of Virginia. Now we proceed to Congressman Don Norquist, all the way from New Jersey.
Thank you, Chairman, and the panel for being here today. It's a fascinating conversation that we've had repeatedly year after year, but certainly in the last few years, it's come to a head, and we very much from a armed services standpoint have looked at the submarine base. The idea that we are going to build submarines is something that everybody knows. So from that perspective, the government is sending the correct signal, but it is much bigger of a problem than that when we look across the entire base. I sit on the hardware committees along with Rob and others, so we've seen the most important thing is a demand signal from government that we're going to build. That's only part of the equation. The other part of the equation is that we follow through on it. I can cite example after example where they go and put the capital into the facility saying we're going to build, and they don't build. Who makes up for that? Now, there's good reasons that happened, but it doesn't help the problem. You know, our industry across the defense ebbs and flows. We'll have surge, but in what we build each and every day, we don't have surge capacity. I suggest, and I've mentioned this before, that we look at a way, how can we surge? You start out with your facilities, which you say generally we have them, but they can be ready. The raw materials or the equipment to build it, and then what Rob said, and I firmly believe, the longest lead item, the hardest to get and the hardest to retain is the human side of this. So, with that being the pinch point on this, how do we look at the American workforce creating surge capacity that we don't do? You can have your core people. The one industry that does this every day is construction. They have hiring halls. When things go well, they hire them. When they don't, they let go. But they always keep their core group. Why haven't we looked at that? Because very skilled, something you can hire and lay them off when you're finished, and that is their world. So let me go right down the list and start with you, Mr. Paxton. Surge capacity, which is a pinch point.
Yes, sir. We've been on a peacetime footing for decades, and during that time, China and others, while we've been on our peacetime footing, China and others have massively invested in their industrial base to build up their capability, building military vessels right next to commercial vessels.
So that's their surge. They can flip back and forth.
That's right, sir. And again, they're building vessels not to the level of complexity and lethality and survivability as our vessels, but they are building next to commercial assets, and they build a lot. 1,700 ships is a big order book in a year. So that's the difference in China. And here in surge capacity, you know, I think of a Philly shipyard, which is up your way. That shipyard was down to 60 employees. Mm-hmm. They got a contract to build a series of national multi-mission vessels, 5 of them, and they ramped up to close to 2,000 employees, and they got other work, and they're going to get more work. So I think when there is a demand signal, you can take a shipyard that had 60 people, and pretty soon you're up to 2,000.
We just suggest the only reason that their commercial side is because of the Jones Act, which many people are looking to dismiss. We lose Jones Act, we lose the entire commercial side.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Norquist.
So I think the first part is when the contracting officer goes to the industry, if they disfavor a bidder with surge capacity because it has a higher price than the one without, you're going to get what you asked for in the contract. So you have to say, I value surge capacity. The other thing is because all of these facilities are drawing from long supply chains, you also want to move away from just-in-time inventory. You want to pay people to be able to store large parts. And this has really 2 advantages to U.S. from national security. One is, if I want the facility to go faster and they go and they lengthen the shift, the parts are there to be able to finish. The second part is if there's a conflict and things are getting disrupted, you have the current back inventory to keep moving while you try and figure out what has happened to the disrupted supply chain. So from a national security point of view, asking for a move away from just-in-time inventory is a national strategic interest of the U.S. government.
Excellent. With 25 seconds, Mr. Fanning.
Yeah, real quick, I would just add that for what we're talking about now, there's a single customer. And so when that customer's demand signal ebbs and flows and the workforce goes away, they go away. And it's very hard to get them back when there's that surge. And it's true with the capital facilities and the supply chains as well.
Thank you. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Desjardins.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. I'd like to spend a little time on defense acquisition reform and deregulation, and I'll start with Mr. Fanning. You noted that the current defense acquisition system is no longer serving key stakeholders effectively, often delaying the adoption of critical technology. What specific reforms would you recommend to streamline the acquisition process while maintaining accountability and oversight?
Well, I think there are different categories here. One is just regulations or requirements that can be changed right away. For example, cost and pricing data, raising the threshold there. Providing costing data that's been validated for one company across the entire defense industrial base. There are lots of different things I think we can do now for efficiencies, but I think the entire system needs to be reviewed because it's been built in an additive way over many years. There's no silver bullet to fix this system, and perhaps you'd want to pick some new advanced technology platforms like drones where you pilot something new for the entire industrial base to compete in and try something that moves faster with a little bit more risk in the oversight.
You mentioned that it takes nearly 300 days on average to award prime contracts over $100 million. I'm glad you highlighted this point because it's utterly insane, but sometimes it helps us when we can see practical effects of these bureaucratic hurdles. So can you provide specific examples where the contract delays have had a direct impact on national security and military readiness to illustrate this point for us?
Well, two things come to mind. One is just the delay of getting something into the warfighter's hands. We're not moving as fast as our incredible manufacturing and technology industries are, and increasing our adversaries are catching up with us. That's one. The second is it has tremendous ramifications on the supply chain, which is already fragile. When it takes so long to get something under contract, smaller companies that don't have the same cash flow, cash reserves, or access to capital, especially in a time when capital is more expensive, money's not free anymore, there's less access to these small companies for it. So these delays make it harder to keep the supply chain whole and to keep it healthy.
Okay. Let's shift gears a little bit, talk about the rare earth minerals and the Ukraine agreement. Earlier this month, we heard from General Jack Keane about the benefits that the United States could gain from securing access to Ukraine's vast mineral resources. Shortly thereafter, President Trump entered negotiations with President Zelensky to finalize an agreement on this issue. Given Ukraine's significant reserves of critical minerals such as titanium, lithium, and rare earth elements, how could such an agreement bolster the U.S. defense industry and mitigate some of these supply chain vulnerabilities?
Well, critical minerals are one of our key priorities, obviously, in industry and Congress, to make sure that we source them better internationally. We just should be realistic also that they are expensive to mine and very difficult to process. And so it's going to take an investment to get that started so that we can source them in a smarter way for the United States.
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question. You just answered it. How do we deal with it once we get them? The defense industrial base has seen significant consolidation over the past few decades, with nearly 70% of the companies that once served DoD in the 1990s either merged or absorbed. As some of you have noted, the transitional primes bring scale, experience, and cash flow to the table, while the smaller firms serve as powerful innovation incubators. From your perspectives, has this level of consolidation successfully balanced these two interests, or is there a tipping point that we may reach? And anyone can answer.
So I think what you always want in the defense industry is a dynamic where new firms are able to come in, and if they are successful, able to grow. So I think the consolidation was a reflection of what was happening with the defense budget. And as you have them, the balance between the sizes of them really should be an outgrowth of firms that are successful, firms that are delivering, moving, and being successful in the market. So my view is you want to see small businesses graduate. You want to see new firms entering. And the challenge is we're not seeing a lot of that right now. We're seeing small firms and others leaving, which is a risk.
Okay. Thank you all. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The state of our defense industrial base is concerning, and there's no argument there. I don't think you're going to hear arguments from us. But we also have a problem where there's just a fundamental lack of competition. And a great example is with the F-35. That program's been around for 24 years. Not once in 24 years have they ever delivered anything ahead of schedule. I'm not sure they've ever even delivered anything on time. Many of the delays with the F-35 we've learned on the committee have to do with the software. And it turns out that Lockheed Martin is not a software company. But of course, America makes the best software in the world. We have a lot of firms that make software. The problem is that Lockheed won't give up the rights to that software. So there's no competition. And we're not tapping into the talent and knowledge in America when it comes to software development. Now, I would argue that if we were on a wartime footing, Lockheed would do the right thing for the country and get others in competing to make software for the F-35. They're not doing that. They continue to report record earnings. So the issue here is that we've got a few primes. They obviously have a vested interest in reducing competition, consolidating the industry. They've been doing that for a long time. And because they love earning calls, they're always going to be investing their own profits. You know, they're making to make sure they're not necessarily, I should say, investing their own profits into innovation. So, Mr. Fanning, you expressed concern in your testimony that 40% of small businesses have stopped working with DoD in the past decade. What can we do as an industry to actually encourage more small business competition?
I think there are a couple things. One, the increasing barriers to entry for small businesses. AIA members work in space, commercial aviation, and defense. Quite a few of them, especially in the supply chain, as a risk mitigation for their business strategies, are doing defense and non-defense work. And I see all the time where and by the way, all the commercial aviation components, helicopters, airplanes, aftermarket services are surging right now. So there's a demand on the supply chain, and when they see the burdensome requirements to work with the Department of Defense, they move over to the other side. So that one part is, as David was saying earlier, finding ways to encourage, incentivize in the contracts, recognize, and unfortunately pay for that diversity in the supply chain is one element. The other is competition comes from competitions. The number of things that we're building and competing out, the number of platforms has also shrunk over that time, which is why, in some ways, we have less competition.
Do you think if we stripped out the red tape and bureaucracy, and all of a sudden you'd see small businesses getting a higher percentage of contracts over the primes?
Well, no, it's about scaling, I think. And the issue is that the pyramid of the industrial base looks a little bit more like a dumbbell now for the reasons we were discussing in the earlier questions about why aren't companies able to grow from small to medium and then to large and to compete for some of these bigger programs. I think that's what we have to explore, is that mid-tier element of the industrial base that has atrophied.
Mr. Paxton, you say that we don't have a capacity problem in our shipyards. We just need to improve efficiency. What's your position on competition? Do you support competition?
I do support competition.
Okay, so then why, when I hear so many senior naval officers asking to be able to repair their ships overseas in allied nations like South Korea and Japan, do we not allow that?
Yeah, well, we do. Certainly, if there's a battle damage, or if there's repairs.
Yeah, but we're not just dealing with battle damage, right? We have a fleet. The amphibious fleet has a cumulative 28.5 years in training and deployment time backed up because of lack of maintenance. So, like, we've got a problem today. You're telling us to be on a wartime footing. Mm-hmm. I've been a constant critic of Congress, and we need to do more to modernize. But what can you do? You support competition. Naval officers want to repair their ships closer to the fight, increase competition, more capacity, get them done sooner.
Yes, sir.
And you're against that?
No, sir. If there's emerging ship repair issues, we are all about get it done there. We in the fleet concentration areas, we have private businesses that are investing in our facilities to repair the non-nuclear surface ships, and we have large investments in those home ports at a time where the fleet's shrinking and those workloads and those home ports are going down. We don't believe we should send more work overseas when that work should be coming home, and quality life.
Well, I'll tell you what, Mr. Chairman, I think what we should do what's right for the Navy,
Yes, sir. I
for
agree.
the fight.
I agree.
So thank you for that. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Mesmer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fanning, spectrum is a valuable, finite resource, and there's those in Congress who want to require the DoD to vacate its spectrum allocations, which I believe would weaken the DoD's ability to protect the homeland and cause other operational harms. It would cost taxpayers billions of dollars to do that. The Defense Industrial Base is a critical partner in that spectrum for the, and if the DoD was to require to vacate the spectrum, such as the lower 3 band or the 7/8 band, what would the cost and effect of that relocation have on our national security platforms? What would the cost be to the taxpayer, and what kind of time would that take to reallocate those to other locations?
Thanks for that question. Spectrum is a longstanding, very important issue, and we all benefit by having more entities like telecoms in the spectrum. We benefit in many ways, but when it impacts the Department of Defense, we have to be extra cautious about it. We didn't imagine when we were allocating spectrum and then building for it in the Department of Defense that there'd be so much demand for it at this point, and that other things would be adjacent so close to the parts of spectrum that DoD has. So we didn't test or build or understand at the time what interference might mean, and so we need to understand that very carefully if we're thinking about adding new things to the spectrum, especially if it butts up against the Department of Defense. We can learn from recent experience in civil aviation, and because our members went through that as well, and hopefully won't repeat those mistakes. One is get the sides talking. Commercial aviation and telecoms are now collaborating very closely, and mostly that's because we get the engineers in a room together who understand this stuff, and we get the engineers of the new spectrum owners and the manufacturers. So it wasn't just the airlines. We had to get the manufacturers in there to figure out the interference. That cost the airlines, the manufacturers, and ultimately the flying public a lot of money. We had to retrofit 15,000 aircraft when we did that. So there will be a tremendous expense, even more so with the Department of Defense, and that will be a taxpayer expense that we need to take into account and should come out of any auction proceeds that come from selling that spectrum. So I would caution that we do this very carefully. Smart people come up with smart solutions. But just like civil aviation, the risk tolerance for the Department of Defense is higher than any other industry that's going to be in spectrum.
I would imagine that the other allocations we've done, we would call that the low-hanging fruit, and the cost would be billions to relocate those spectrums now. Mr. Norquist, pivoting slightly, if the DoD was asked to share spectrum, what are the considerations that the Defense Industrial Base would have to do to do that?
So I think when it comes to the Defense Industrial Base and with the DoD looking at spectrum, each of these are very fact-specific, and part of the challenge when you're looking at from the outside is how many of them deal with either classified programs or aspects that are classified. So I think you'd have to look first at the cost, which systems are affected, how much would you have to retrofit. You have to look at the mission impact. Does it even function well if it's moved to a different spectrum, if the controls are put upon it? So I think I would urge somebody to approach this with caution, to make sure they fully understood from both an unclassified and a classified side, both the mission impact and the cost and the timeline that's involved if you're trying to convert legacy systems over to a new technology.
Okay. Either one of you could answer this. What kind of systems are supported in the lower 3 and the 7/8 bands?
Well, some very critical things like ballistic missile early warning are in these bands. And so it's not just that it's Department of Defense. They have some of their critical programs in those bands. And so, again, what we learned on the civil side is it's not just about who's in the band. It's about the interference of putting things nearby, which wasn't anticipated and therefore built into the requirements or built into the programs. Has to be understood very carefully before you make a change.
Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back my time.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Fanning, I want to make sure I heard you correctly. Did you say these words, the risk tolerance at the DoD is higher?
No, the opposite.
Okay.
For civil aviation,
I've
for the
never
Department
heard
of
that
Defense.
phrase with the DoD.
I don't, telecoms, that was part of the issue on the civil aviation side, is risk to them was a little bit different. If they encountered interference, they'd find a way to fix it operationally. For civil aviation and for defense, for the military, we need to know. that the risk is zero before we make a change.
Okay, thank you. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Fanning, good to see you again. As you know, I've had the privilege of interacting with AIA through my role as co-chair of the House Aerospace Caucus. Companies in my district have told me time and time again that there is a need to change the way we allow research and development activities to be expensed. Can you speak about what changes are needed to address this R&D expensing issue and how making this change will benefit the industrial base?
In the previous round of tax reform, they switched the, or I should say, sunsetted the R&D tax amortization, where if you spend a dollar in a year, you got to deduct that in that year, to a 5-year amortization cycle. So you got 20% of your investment. At the same time, China doubled it. They gave you a 200% deduction for every investment you made in R&D in real time. That affects not just big companies that get the attention, because that aggregates into a lot of money, but very small companies as well that are doing R&D that have to stop doing it. With the cash flow problems that small companies like in your district are facing, they can't afford what becomes the luxury of R&D investments, and that's not good for our economy, for our country, for our national security, because they're doing some of the most interesting cutting-edge innovation and research, but they can't afford it because they have cash flow problems by not getting that deduction in the year they spend it.
Thank you for shedding light on that. Something I've heard from the space industry over and over again is that they are facing a shortfall of skilled workers. I have no doubt that this isn't unique to the space industry. Mr. Fanning, Mr. Paxton, and Mr. Norquist, do your organizations have any programs, or are you working on ideas to develop a talent pipeline to develop this skilled workforce? And do you see Congress playing a role in developing this pipeline?
Our companies are doing a number of things. They've recognized they've got to step in, work with local community colleges, local high schools, even earlier than that, for example. But there is certainly a role for Congress and the government in terms of STEM education and vocational education in our public education system. We're not producing the same numbers of people in those two categories as we did when I went to school. And so we're just not feeding into the system students ready to go into what is a highly skilled industry that pays well. So I think that there are things on both sides we should be doing. We have a number of proposals for things that we'd like to see from government, and this has to start early. AI runs the world's largest student rocketry challenge, which is middle schoolers and high schoolers, over 1,000 teams competing this year alone, just to keep that STEM pipeline pumped. Because what we find is if you don't keep kids engaged in STEM education, they'll go into something else. And so you've got to keep them from elementary school to middle school to high school to college. But what we see is just the numbers keep dropping. It's 1 in 6 high school graduates is prepared to study STEM in college, and fewer than 50% who start actually finish and get a STEM degree.
Thank you. Mr. Norquist?
So 2 things. First of all, as an association, we do scholarships for students wanting to study STEM, to be able to promote that, and if they're coming into the defense. When we survey our membership, though, what we see is on STEM skills, about 20% say they don't have enough. On trade skills, it's closer to 30%, and then you see a similar 30% when you look at cleared. And each one of those, they highlight the difficulty and the challenge in recruiting. So this workforce challenge has been mentioned before, is extensive, and it pervades the point. I just also want to jump back. The majority of our members are small businesses, and that R&D tax credit is very important to them. So I know you had brought that up earlier, but the effect on small businesses is significant as well.
Thank you. Mr. Paxton?
Yeah, thank you for the question, sir. The Shipbuilders Council of America is a facilitator for the talent pipeline programs that we have around the nation. We have a program in Danville, Virginia, not SCA, it's funded by the Navy, but where we, teach world-class welding and pipe fitting and machine work and electricity work. And so we're doing it. We're investing in the next generation workforce.
Thank you. I have limited time, Mr. Fanning. I'm going to submit this question. If you could answer it later on, I would really appreciate it. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman from California. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. McGuire, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. After being inspired by Ronald Reagan to join the Navy, he talked about building a 600-ship Navy. He talked about American exceptionalism. He talked about peace through strength. I was inspired to join the Navy and served as a Navy SEAL. And this was a time when the United States Armed Forces was at the peak of their strength since World War II. It saddens me that we've allowed our readiness and investment in defense industrial base to decline in the 35 years since the end of the Cold War. I think you guys used the term earlier, atrophied in every way. According to most recent data, the Chinese Navy consists of over 400 ships, 225 armed Chinese Coast Guard vessels of 500 tons or more, and vast numbers in the inventory of their maritime militia. The United States 7th Fleet has between 50 and 70 ships near the China and South China Sea. We must work together to ensure that our armed forces and Navy can overcome this threat posed by the CCP. Mr. Paxton, thank you for appearing here today for the committee. The challenges facing the defense industrial base, specifically the submarine industrial base, are concerning and must be addressed immediately. The challenges facing the defense industrial base, specifically the submarine industrial base, are timely. As I'm sure you know, the overall capacity of our shipbuilding industrial base has significantly degraded since the Cold War. Over the last 30 years, thousands of businesses have left the shipbuilding supplier base, limiting the Navy's options. I'm particularly concerned about this, especially as we look forward to the future with near-peer competitors such as the CCP, who are aggressively growing their fleet, and our own need to recapitalize our fleet and surface ships and submarines. Do you agree that this lack of competition is unsustainable and needs attention?
I believe, Congressman, there is competition to build the platforms, the fleet mix that we have, that our shipyards have the physical capacity to do this. And I'll just give you a reference point. In the 1980s, we were building 4.2 attack submarines a year, 2.5 DDGs a year. I don't think the difference in capacity was different. I think what was different was the experience in the workforce. We had veteran workforce that was building those assets and building them at scale and building them in serious construction. We got away from that demand signal, and the subsequent workforce has suffered. And we've had consolidation, as you know, sir.
Well, that's why I'm glad to hear us talk about CTE. So also, I say, I'm also aware of the recent congressional investments to develop the future workforce within the defense industrial base, in part through the creation of regional training centers such as the Advanced Training and Defense Manufacturing ATDM program, which we have right there in Danville, Virginia, in my district. I toured that last week, and it's amazing how they're preparing these young folks. And they basically are creating a maritime training pipeline in several other locations in the United States. Do you agree that it is imperative to regenerate and grow the shipbuilding and ship repair workforce throughout the country?
Congressman, absolutely. We're at a generational point, and I do think we're seeing the demand signal from, again, the Maritime Industrial Base program that was set up and the work that's going on at Danville. These are programs that are being replicated around the country, and I think we are going to hire and build the next generation workforce.
Well, I'm not a welder, but they don't just qualify welders. They qualify welders to do just about anything you would need for submarines. It's amazing. And not everybody's meant to go to college. And some of these folks, they complete this course, and they're making six figures right out the gate. And a lot of them are doing such a good job, but they're putting them to work on submarines and everywhere right away.
Yes, sir.
As a fresh member of the committee, I too support continued investment in the people, facilities, and suppliers that enable shipbuilding and ship repair in our country. So, Mr. Paxton, what can members of this committee do to provide for this critical national capability? And what does the industry need? What more should the Navy be doing?
Well, sir, I commend this committee for all the things they have done. We have a demand signal that the shipyard industry is building towards. The industry reflects that demand signal. If it is going to keep going up, which we hope it does, we will ramp up that workforce to meet it. It will take some time and challenges, but the work of this committee to authorize multi-year contracts, those type of things provide the stability that the industry needs.
All right, one last question for everyone, if you have something to say. I just talked to some folks in Israel, and they said perfect is the enemy of good enough, and sometimes they get a program in the field quickly, and it's battle-tested because time is an issue, and we're taking so long. And if y'all had any comments on that.
That's correct. That's a challenge. I recognize the time is short, but you are correct. That's a challenge.
Thank you, everyone, for participating.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the members of the committee, and I thank our witnesses for dealing with this important discussion and going back and forth on it. But I feel like I'm sitting here at this moment in time, in this place, a little like, with this hearing, a little like Mrs. Lincoln, who was questioned, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the theater? We're sitting here now, just in the last few weeks, where the President of the United States has stated that Russia is not the aggressor in Ukraine, that indeed Ukraine was responsible for the war, that the duly elected democratic leader of Ukraine is a dictator. In a time period where they had a meeting, our administration in Saudi Arabia, with someone that they've sanctioned, our country has sanctioned, and representing a war criminal to the exclusion of the Ukrainians, to the exclusion of our NATO allies and our European allies. The same period where a shameful act in the United Nations occurred for our country with the President's leadership, where they're sided with Russia and China and Belarus and Hungary to the exclusion of our European allies. So we're here talking about, as the title of this committee goes, our industrial base. Well, when we tell Europe and the rest of the world, you're on your own, we're sitting here worried about strengthening our industrial base. They're going to be creating their own to the exclusion of the U.S.'s industrial base with U.S. assets, U.S. training, and they're going to gain influence around the world. And that includes our adversaries and our enemies like China that'll be advantaged the most of this. We're giving them a green light. So we're talking about this hearing with the concern on deterring war, while we're sitting there making sure we're giving a green light to everyone else in the future. That's where we are right now. So when we have these hearings and we're talking about what we should do, we better put it in perspective and realize what's going on in our own country. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Amadei of Arizona for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. As we look at ways of strengthening our defense industrial base, one thing is clear: a backlog of unfulfilled foreign military sales is not just a paperwork issue, it's a national security problem. I faced these challenges during my time as an Army Reserve intelligence officer facilitating our military sales in Saudi Arabia. Delays in delivering critical defense systems to our allies undermine our ability to deter enemies, strengthen partnerships, and sustain our own domestic defense industry. At the same time, adversaries like China have streamlined their arms export processes, leveraging speed and influence to expand their global footprint. The U.S. must do better. We cannot afford bottlenecks and bureaucratic inertia in an era of strategic competition. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on how we can accelerate our production, cut red tape, and ensure a defense industrial base is not just responsive, but proactive in meeting both the United States and our allied defense needs. Now, my first question is for Mr. Fanning. My understanding is that after the cancellation of the Future Attack Reconnaissance Aircraft program, we did not divert resources to continue Apache acquisitions. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Do you know why that was?
I don't.
Now, Boeing's Apache productions in Arizona is at risk. If the DoD doesn't commit to a minimum order of 12 or so helicopters, the production line could be shut down, putting 5,000 Phoenix area jobs on the line. Now, that's not just bad for Arizona's economy. It sends the wrong message to our allies, and our foreign partners won't invest in a platform if they think the U.S. military is moving on from that platform. Now, how do we ensure our domestic acquisition policies stay consistent, both with our long-term defense plans and the needs of our allies who rely on these systems?
Congressman, thanks for that question. That sort of hits at the crux of, I think, what we're talking about today, which is sending not just a clear signal to our allies, but to the industrial base, so that it invests its money in the facilities, in the workforce, in the supply chain, so that it can meet the needs of the Department of Defense. And so that, if I had one single headline for what we need for the defense industrial base, it is that clear, consistent, and sufficient demand signal so that the industrial base and the private capital that supports it can line up for DoD requirements.
And how do delays in the foreign military sales impact your members' companies?
Well, it's a frustration all the way around. I mean, as I said in my oral statement, last year, for the first time, foreign military sales and direct military sales exceeded what the Department of Defense spends on military equipment and RDT&E. That's American jobs. That brings down the price for the Department of Defense. That's interoperability. That binds our allies closer with us over a longer period of time. We want to make sure that the wrong people aren't getting our stuff, and with the administration decides that. But if the answer is yes, we want to get there quickly. Our allies want to buy our kit, our stuff, and we make it as hard as can be for them to do that. If the answer is no, we should get there quickly as well. So one of our top priorities at AIA is trying to reform and streamline that system. So it meets the intent of making sure bad actors in the world don't get the stuff that we produce, but we ought to be bringing our allies along faster and making sure that we're not disincentivizing them in anything we do to buy someplace else. Oftentimes I see people, it's a pocket veto system. We have got to switch the default to yes. People make their case, or they don't make their case and move forward, because there are other places that countries can go to buy hardware.
Mr. Norquist, do you have anything to add?
Oh, yes, sir. A couple of things. First of all, in our membership surveys, 55% said foreign military sales and domestic commercial sales were either very or extremely important to the company, creates jobs in the U.S., but it also empowers our allies to defend themselves. You asked for recommendations on change. I'll give you three. First of all, Defense and State had looked at FMS reforms, but they haven't finalized or been executing on that. So getting them to finalize those FMS reforms and then begin to execute them would be essential, and then reporting back. There's also an issue with the ability to switch to direct commercial sales. In many cases, direct commercial sales can go faster, and that's actually within the control of the department to say, this should move as an FMS case. As it move as a direct commercial sale, that will go faster. And the last is to build on what Eric said. There have been reviews about the interagency process. It's very slow and sequential, and trying to accelerate that, and that was per Section 918 of your NDAA, pushing them to bring that to closure is very helpful. So those are three ones, what you talked about.
Thank you, Mr. Norquist. I'm sure my staff will be in communication with you to tackle this problem that I see is really pressing, especially when our allies now are no longer purchasing our equipment and seeking elsewhere. Thank you. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair, and I recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony today. I found it very interesting, and it, as a result of your testimony, has had me change my questions just a little bit. Our job here on the HASC is, I believe, to ensure that our defense industrial base is resilient and responsive and that it is ready. Interestingly enough, just yesterday, the House passed a $100 billion increase in defense spending in the DoD, and also concurrently and curiously, Secretary Hegseth has asked for an 8% annual decrease, and these things are schizophrenic and confusing in my mind, and we can kind of put that to the side. But the bottom line is we have a responsibility to the taxpayers and to our constituents to be responsible for their resources and for their money, and to understand how to be optimize as much as possible our expenses for workforce, for production lines, for the industrial base as well. Mr. Norquist, you said something really intriguing about just-in-time manufacturing. My background is in industrial engineering. My master's degree thesis was in JIT manufacturing for the airframe industry, defense airframe industry. Back in the day, that was the thing. We really wanted to streamline manufacturing in that way. And I'm intrigued by the fact that JIT probably has become passé as a result of the shocks to our supply chain from COVID and other things. Can you dive a little bit deeper in what it would look like and whether we've actually done some studies and whether there's been some conclusions, real conclusions about what the defense industrial base would look like if we actually did carry inventory, and what kind of inventory would it be, and would it be stockpiled, and would it be additive manufacturing, and all of those kinds of things, the devil's in the details. Can you kind of drill down on whether that's a good investment to carry inventory?
Sure, and I think there's three levels at which you can do it, and I think the nature of the product you're trying to buy drives it. So the first one is you can stockpile the final product. You can stockpile the munitions in anticipate of a war requirement. Most people are familiar with that, but we should relook whether that's right. The second one is the parts coming into the supply chain. So you have somebody who assembles. They may have inventory doing just-in-time arrival that's cheap, that's efficient. The private sector's refined that, but that doesn't allow you to surge, and that creates real risks in wartime. Knowing which are those products that you're willing to say to the vendor, we would like you to hold 30, 60 days worth of parts, so a disruption to your subcontractor, those would be very essential. You'd have to do some analysis on what are those things you're most vulnerable. The third one is one where we've seen studies out of the defense, which looks at even stockpiling raw materials, which is if we are not worried about a disruption to a U.S. vendor, but actually overseas supplier, can we buy enough of that material and keep it here to be able to be refined and produced so other countries can shut it off? So I think there's 3 levels at which people look at that.
And I appreciate that, and in the interest of time, would love to follow up with you about how to look at that through the NDAA and be a little bit more thoughtful on that. Transitioning now to the other way that we can be responsible is with workforce, and a lot of your conversation today is focused on that. We have seen through the DOGE a haphazard, in my opinion, laying off of people who are provisional employees. That, to me, smacks of getting rid of our youngest and newest people in many cases. We also had a long conversation with you all about STEM professionals and STEM education. I myself, as I mentioned, am an engineer, and we have 51% of our workforce presumably who are women, and yet we're in the process of devaluing, making sure we emphasize the fact that women can be STEM professionals as well, particularly in the defense industry. You, as the defense industry and the defense industrial base, if you could each comment a little bit on what you feel is happening now that we are saying effectively that 51% of our workforce doesn't need to be paid attention to.
Well, I think it's imperative, and our companies feel that way. They should be recruiting from the broadest population that the United States has to offer. And in some ways, if your workforce doesn't reflect the United States, it may be that you're not recruiting in a smart and comprehensive way. So that's important to us. Workforce is the #1 strategic risk, concern, priority of our industry.
Could I ask of industry that you put some pressure on those of us who are sitting across here to tell us that this is indeed important? Mr. Norquist and Mr. Paxton, with the 17 seconds I have left, I would love to hear if you have any input in that area.
Just, we need to be strategic in how we do this, and we value all our workers.
Thank you.
Yes, you need to pull from the entire population, the workforce, to be able to take advantage of the skill sets and the technologies. And so, as Eric pointed out, you got to make sure you're recruiting from everywhere so you can bring the best and the brightest.
Thank you. I appreciate it, and I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from the strategically important territory of Guam, Mr. Moylan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, Guam remains a vital strategic asset in the Indo-Pacific as we look to safeguard the defense of our nation. Its location makes it a critical logistical hub for the movement of personnel and supplies crucial to maintaining our presence in the region. And as a nation, we face challenges in the defense industry base, especially regarding shipyards and shipbuilding. The ship repair facility in Guam was closed in 1997 as part of the base realignment and closure process. The facility was shut down with the equipment remaining in place, and it's still there today. Now, with the growing threats and tensions in the Indo-Pacific, we must prioritize improving our readiness capabilities. This includes ensuring that we have the infrastructure to support our Navy ships and submarines, which serve as the backbone for deterrence and protection in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, as we prepare for potential future conflicts, it's vital that we make full use of every available resource, including boosting maintenance and repair capabilities. We cannot ignore Guam's potential to provide an expanded capability and support needed to keep our military assets ready and operational in this critical region. So my question for Mr. Paxton. As I stated earlier, the ship repair facility in Apra Harbor, Guam, was closed in 1997. The facility is still owned by the Navy and is available for leasing to a shipyard company, offering potentials for ship repair and maintenance services. Could you provide an insight into the advantages of restoring the Guam shipyard as a domestic repair facility?
Congressman, I think to the extent that we can have strategic capacity and we can have it available to us, we should absolutely be looking at that and finding ways to utilize it the best way possible.
Is time an issue? Do we have serious time constraints in our hands with our Indo-Pacific region?
For sure. I mean, we need that area to be very strategic. We need it to be capable. And so to the extent that, there's private industry out there that wants to try to do something with that facility, we would support private industry taking that on.
How important? Rate it, 1 through 5, 1 being the best.
It's very important.
All right, well, thank you. Next question is for Mr. Norquist. What steps can be taken to improve the resilience and the defense industry base against potential disruptions, such as natural disasters, especially in our area?
So that, as you point out, that there are multiple challenges to it. You have everything from natural disasters that can disrupt a supplier, and one thing that people forget is the product may be made in one location, but the parts may be made in another, and so therefore, if the storm hits one area, you can have an effect. The same thing is with cyber attack, right? You can have an attack on a supplier, and at the end of the day, you can't finalize assembly until you have all of those pieces. So you have to look at a number of things. One is making places more resilient, in storm damage against other items. Same thing is on cyber protection, and then the third is figuring out how to have supplies moving through so that there is always some capacity. So a short-term disruption while you get a facility up and running doesn't stop everything downstream from the supply chain from it. With our strategic location and our distance being an issue, what do you think about Guam? Are we prepared with what you just said? So I think that the challenge is when you look at the Pacific, Guam is so central to the strategy, right? There's multiple things, whether it's air ranges, repairing on location, movement of supplies. It is the hub for many of those, which brings you both to the question of protecting it, as well as which are the things that you want to prioritize using in that space. Is it prepositioning? Is it facility and production? Is it repair? But when you look at, it's often hard. People have to get them a globe and rotate and say, look at the Pacific. All right, and some places you can't see the either ends, but in the middle you can see there's Guam. So trying to just understand the sheer scale of distance in the Pacific and how much that challenges U.S. logistics operations, and therefore understanding the role of Guam in those types of operations. That's key. Thank you to the panel. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists. We've talked a lot about workforce today and the importance of workforce. I'm really proud to represent San Diego, one of our major shipbuilding hubs. But I've noticed that one of the things we haven't talked about workforce is actually the role immigration plays. And it struck me that many of my colleagues who are worried about workforce are the same ones who are saying we should restrict immigration, restrict legal immigration. So I guess, Mr. Fanning, could you talk about how restricting immigration would have an impact on these defense industrial base industries that we really need?
All aspects of workforce need to be on the table and discussed, including immigration. A lot of our workers are cleared, highly skilled, take years to train, but no workforce exists in isolation. And so if any industry is having problems with its workforce, it could create problems for ours, including driving up wages. So I do think we need to discuss that and making sure if we can't organically fill the workplace needs in our country, how we go about an immigration policy that helps with that.
Thank you. And, we've talked a lot today also about these big, exquisite capabilities, right? F-35s, ships. But I think one of the lessons of Ukraine is that military dominance isn't just about how much money we spend and how many big things we have, right? It's about agility, adaptability, cost-effective innovation. And one of the things that frustrates me about these conversations sometimes is we keep hearing demand signal, demand signal, demand signal. Well, the demand for munitions like 155 rounds couldn't be clearer. The demand for things like Patriots couldn't be clearer. And yet we're still having them not be produced at the rate that we need them. So I guess, Mr. Norquist, can you talk about some of these other capabilities and why we aren't seeing the defense industrial production that we need for munitions, for, you know, these kinds of things?
Right, so typically what you have is you have something in a munition where either the demand signal wasn't there, or if you think of something like the Gimlers, the demand signal was there and the CRs blocked the ramp up of the production, so you ended up with fewer than you wanted. Then you have an event like Ukraine where all of a sudden there's a surge in demand, industry starts to see the signal, starts to respond, but in some cases the government says, and by the way, as soon as this is resolved, the demand's going to go to zero. And then industry says, well, okay, then I'll expand my current team as fast as I can, but I'm not going to do a new or second or third line because by the time they're on board, you may have stopped the purchase. So when people talk about the stability, one of the concerns is, and it's not irrational, the government has an increase in demand, and when something passes, it drops. And yet that swing has the very disruptive effect on the capacity. There are things we can do. There's abilities to help with companies in terms of getting being able to qualify access to capital, to be able to expansions, be able to draw on workforce, and looking at choke points in the supply chain. So I think those are all key, and sometimes it's the least glamorous stuff that's the most important.
Thank you. And Mr. Paxton, I just want to ask you that the Shipyard Infrastructure Optimization Program, it was intended to be a generational investment, right, to bring our public yards into the 21st century, and yet what we've seen is that costs have ballooned, timelines have slipped, and we still don't have a full cost estimate for the program. We've seen the industry benefit from significant government support, including long-term contracts and subsidies and infrastructure funding. And some might argue that this has actually reduced the incentive for the private sector to invest in shipyard modernization, leaving the government to foot the bill for these upgrades. So how should we strike the balance between the necessary public investments, but also ensuring that the private sector is making their own meaningful contributions to our domestic shipbuilding base?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Congresswoman. For sure, the SIOP is critically important for our four public shipyards. We need those. Those are critical assets in the inventory of our shipyard industrial base. They obviously do all the nuclear propulsions systems, but private shipyard investment, we have been spending in the order of billions in our facilities and our workforce on the private side of things. And when we see that demand signal, to Mr. Norquist's comments, we respond, but it does take time. It does take time to ramp that workforce up, but the investments are being made.
Thank you. I just got to say, I am so frustrated by the whole concept of demand signal because I just feel like this committee couldn't have been clearer for the 4 years I've been on it so far about the kinds of things we want to see. And so, like, I think we've got to get away from just saying we need more money, less oversight, and get to some real solutions. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Virginia, Ms. Kiggins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for our panelists for joining us. I have the privilege of representing Hampton Roads area, so home to a lot of our ship repair businesses and just defense industry in general, large and small businesses. We have meetings with them about their frustration with our budget process and passing continuing resolutions, and I know that they are disproportionately impacted by these continuing resolutions that we continue to pass. We passed one, and then we passed another, and now we're facing another deadline where we perhaps may pass one that will lead to a full year CR. And as a person who is newer to Congress in my second term, continues to frustrate me as a person who wants to be an advocate for our defense industry, who wants to make sure that you all understand how much money you all have to work with. So, Mr. Fanning, I know you touched on it earlier, but could you, just for the record, tell us what the impact of a full long CR would be for your industry?
A year-long CR is particularly disruptive, especially if it has limited anomalies. New programs don't start. I mean, I think this is what people don't understand, is that a CR is just saying continue with the last year's plan. And so if there's a new start baked into it and companies have invested in it all up and down the supply chain, lined up their workforce, lined up the materials, the parts, and get ready to go, it doesn't happen, it's a tremendous financial hit on them. Again, especially on small companies, ones that I think you're talking to in your district, that don't have the cash flow or the access to capital to withstand that type of a delay. And this is what, sort of feeds into having that consistent signal from the government so that all of that is required to line up to produce what the government needs when it needs it takes place in a way. And it causes not just a disruption in building those supply chains, it causes a disruption in trust for the companies, large, small, in between, to lean forward and invest, to be ready, because they do that. They want to do that. They're all doing risk and strategy assessments every year. Where am I going to put my money? So hopefully it lines up with what the government needs at that point. And a CR that doesn't have anomalies in it is basically skipping a year for that change, that growth, that increase in quantity orders or what have you. And again, it causes industry to react conservatively to what they're hearing from government, because they've got to see that there is something at the end of their investment.
Thank you very much. Just wanted that to be made very clear. Let's see. So also in my district with ship repair, the ship repair industry that we have there, we are seeing, because of the CR, a lot of them have to lose staff. They are having just to change how they do business. I know we've heard our colleagues talk about the number of ships we don't have in the U.S. Navy right now, so perhaps not enough business for ship repair. We're seeing them do things that are a little bit outside the box, participate in some of the modular build programs, working with Huntington Ingalls, and we have close proximity, so we can build modular components and ship them up the river to Huntington Ingalls. We have a wind turbine project off the coast of Virginia Beach that we're seeing some ship repair even being involved with staging and some manufacturing. So they're trying to do some things, which I applaud them for, to compensate for the budgetary issues that we are facing. But Mr. Paxton, do you see these kind of thinking outside the box options that my local ship repair industry is pursuing as good alternatives to ways that we can just keep that skilled workforce in place so that they don't have to shift around so much?
For sure. We're having a constant internal discussion about commercial ship repair. A lot of your yards down your way, while they do amazing Navy maintenance and modernization, used to have a lot more commercial ship repair work. For a lot of reasons, that commercial ship repair has gone overseas. We should be clawing that back and doing more of that. I will say Virginia leads the way, Virginia Ship Repair Association, in educating the local communities down there on the just patriotic jobs that are in our shipyard. So Bill Crow does an amazing job.
They're great. We appreciate them. Mr. Norquist, do you have anything to add on that?
So I was just going to come back to the point you had on CRs. I think there's, we have had over 1,900 days, over 1,900 days of CRs in the last 16 years, equivalent to being 5 full years. And each of those is telling defense and companies and the military that whatever you need next, don't do it. Go back to do the things that we would have told you to stop doing. And that becomes incredibly disruptive. And people think, well, they can just do the same as last year. You passed a pay raise. A CR doesn't accommodate the pay raise that you would have to figure. There's a series of changes that this committee and others have voted on to say we need DoD in a different direction. A CO says, never mind, do the old plan. I can understand why it's very appealing for China. For us to keep doing these, I don't understand why it's in our interest, and I think it's a real challenge for our membership to have to deal with. I know you guys are more frustrated than this as much as anybody else, but and the shipbuilding is all a new start, so every one of these is a big setback, and so I'd be very concerned on the effect of a long-term CR.
Thank you. I share your frustration. I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you.
Well, as a very senior member of the Congress, I can tell you most of the members who tolerate CRs as an acceptable option are just ignorant of the impact of those resolutions. With that, I recognize the gentleman from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I think we have the right 3 people here in your membership. You represent collectively basically the entire defense, at least the traditional defense industry. Between the 5 big primes, Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop, GD, and RTX, over $200 billion in defense revenue last year alone. Rough math, that's about $130 billion from contracts from DoD, 15% of our entire defense budget. And since that's really discretionary spending, that essentially means $1 in $12 we're spending as a country went to these 5 companies. And we thank you and the employees that are doing that work. Given that context, though, and you may have seen or heard a little bit in the news about government efficiency has been certainly a topic. In the first month or so, while the Trump administration has found time to fire 6,000 veterans, to fire thousands just Friday night at the DoD, they haven't yet found time to highlight any specific examples of the supposed waste, fraud, and abuse at the Department of Defense, which constitutes, as I said, a huge part of our spending, and I agree. So could each of you just name one program, could be major, could be minor, one thing that we should cut? Mr. Fanning, start with you.
I think I think a lot of things are being conflated.
Just one.
What's
just
going on
one
right
thing.
I think you know, every program is there for a reason. It doesn't
Okay.
mean it can't be more efficient.
Mr.
But I don't know,
Norquist?
top of mind, we
Will you point
focus
to
on
one
the
thing?
industry, yeah.
I only have a few minutes.
So I'll just say, when I was in the department, we did a defense-wide review, and we proposed $5 billion worth of reduction. So there are people who are constantly producing recommendations. The challenge is one person's offset is another's essential requirement, and you have to work through both the politics and the mission impact.
What would you say, given your expertise, is the number one thing?
The number one thing I would do is I'd actually change the requirements process, because I think it has
What's
an
the
effect
one
all the way through.
program that you would eliminate?
In
In
I
our
think
entire
I walked
budget?
through. I could give you a copy of the report that we produced.
I'd love to follow up
Yeah,
on that.
I'm happy to.
Mr. Paxton?
Again, I echo my colleagues' comments on this. I think the sheer volume of the DFARS needs to be contracted.
And I agree, and I know I'm being somewhat provocative here, but it's incredibly frustrating to me that we're all in high-level agreement and there's been incessant talk of the need for efficiency, and you all are the experts and your members, and we would love to work with you. I would love to work with you, and I think there are a lot of members that know there are legacy things that were out there from, I'm 42, that have been out there, you know, in the ether from before I was alive, that even our services are saying we don't need. So I do think it would be helpful to not speak at the up in the clouds level, but we need to be specific and have those details. To that end, my second question, and we've talked a lot about hardware-focused programs, which are, of course, a huge driver of our budget, but I want to talk about some of the legacy software programs across the Department of Defense that are ridiculously over budget, archaic, and largely, in many cases, simply don't work, but are still programs of record because of the broken acquisition system. Largely thanks to cost-plus contracts, hardware-first primes win software-centric contracts, and they just cannot deliver the necessary capability on an appropriate timeline, yet they're rewarded for increasing their business expenses, unnecessary auditing, excessive accounting. I was in Indo-PACOM last week. We were hearing directly from senior leaders that the major Army C2 program, they're literally not even using. It's sitting there, and they're locked in because of a program office's contracts. So, and this is going back to my time in the Army, has the department not learned anything, in your opinion, from going back to the DCGSA fight with Palantir, that hardware-centric primes shouldn't be building software?
I think, because I lived through that, a couple of things I'd say is, first of all, the issue with Palantir at that time, I think, and even SpaceX earlier, was about competition and the nature of competition, and setting up a competition that allowed new entrants to show what they could offer instead of sub-optimizing them. It's hard for us, I think, to pick a program because it's probably one of our companies. I will say that the industry...
That was my not-so-subtle point.
The industry is ready to surge, though. If somebody loses a contract and that money goes to another investment, then there are winners and losers in our industry. That's competition. The industry stands ready to support the decisions Congress and the administration make about which programs to keep, which programs to end.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair, and I recognize
Thank you,
the
Mr. Chair.
gentlelady from New Hampshire, Ms. Goodlander.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses for being here today. I've just come from the Small Business Committee, where we had an opportunity to hear from some of the real innovators in our defense industrial base, who are the smaller players. And I wanted to give an opportunity to our witnesses to talk about the programs that you've seen work well, including the SBIR and STTR programs, which I very much appreciate you've included in this very helpful and thick handout. But if you could speak a little bit more about the smaller, Mr. Fanning, I know you represent family-owned small businesses, the challenges that the small businesses face in our defense industrial base, and what you would encourage Congress to prioritize in our support for those important companies.
I guess small businesses in particular are operating on tighter margins and with fewer resources and tools to get them over perturbations in the system. And we've had a number that are non-government, COVID, for example, inflation, but anything that we can do to be consistent in our timelines and how we deliver on programs and how we deliver on the contracts to include payments helps those small businesses. They're in a real crunch right now. Many of them are still delivering on contracts written pre-inflation, but having to buy their materials at post-inflation prices. So they're just being squeezed in a number of different ways, and anything that government can do to stay consistent on timelines is a lifeline for small businesses.
So we have over 1,000 small businesses as members of our association. It's the majority of our organization. I think our small business chair may have been, in fact, one of your witnesses. So if I contradict ML Mackey's right and I'm wrong. The first thing, of course, is the permanent reauthorization of SBIR STGR. I think that's very essential for the small businesses. That's a great pipeline to bring them in. I think this needs some emphasis on the conversion side. Another one to look at is it's very important to have cybersecurity. The CMMC standards are part of that. But having either guaranteed loans or tax credits for small businesses who have to carry the load of getting compliance would be a particular help to them. And it was mentioned earlier about software. For those of them who are software focused, the reciprocity of authority to operate. They get authority to operate in one place, but then it doesn't carry over to the other. Large firms can manage that. Small firms end up getting trapped with a product they would like to sell and scale, but they're only getting clearance in one place, and there's a cost to that. So I think those are a couple of things that can be done to help small businesses, but again, I appreciate your interest and your emphasis on them.
Well, thank you. I wanted to ask our witnesses if you could say a few words about the National Defense Industrial Strategy that was introduced just a year ago, and how you see the implementation of that strategy. I know there's been a follow-on implementation plan. What is your advice to this committee about the content of that strategy and our progress on implementation?
I'm happy to start. I think that there are two things that stood out to me sort of in a strategic way on the strategy. One is it recognized private capital as a stakeholder, which I hadn't seen in a document before. The other is it explicitly recognized that the defense industrial base is shaped by its single customer. We've learned a lot in Ukraine, a lot of conversation about surge and about demand signals. But it was years of demand signals that got the industrial base to where it was when the war kicked off. And it's not an easy thing to counter. And that's partly because industrial policy, munitions, which you can take a 20% risk on munitions year after year after year after year after year, and the industrial base will shape around that. You can't buy 80% of an aircraft carrier. And so I think those, the problem with surge, the problem with stockpiles, and the problem with industrial policy is in the end game of the budget, they don't compete well to things that you can actually park at a pier or put on a ramp. And that's what I would just remind the ranking member talked about choices. In the end game, it's all about choices, and what you can actually have in your inventory tends to win over these types of investments that we think are critical, because capacity is a capability and it does deter.
So first of all, it was very helpful that the department produced the first National Defense Industrial Strategy. It was a clear recognition of the challenge they're facing, how the challenge came about over time through government policy. I would encourage the new administration to look at that. They're, of course, going to have their own version, but the industrial base has been a priority for them. So to be able to use and draw from that what they value. But I think that's something that the recognition of the effect of certain policies on it, the recognition of rare earth metals, they did a relatively across-the-board look, and so I think that's a great place for someone to start and to build on. And so I'd encourage the committee to look at it and the implementation plan, and then recognize some of those have costs associated with them, and so you just have to pay attention to that.
Well, I thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman. I'll be submitting some more questions for the record and appreciate the time of the witnesses.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Mills from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks so much for being here, gentlemen. Mr. Norquist, great to see you again. Mr. Norquist, I'd like to pivot to another critical concern related to our industrial base, namely supply chain integrity and transparency. I don't think I need to rehash the issues that we have in regards to reliance on adversarial nations for critical components, but even more certain is the critical minerals that we have banned DoD and commercial partners from sourcing from adversarial nations. These restrictions are often too wavered for these individual program managers or these adversarial trading proxies and minority ownerships and taking advantage of these thresholds. So my question, I guess, is that knowing that the responsibility of both DoD and the industrial partners to ensure the United States abides by these responsible acquisition practices, what is the industry doing to ensure transparency in these supply chains?
So each of the companies in the industry is working at it, and there are companies that are helping produce tools to let you map your supply chain and be able to understand what's coming from where. This is both a supply interruption risk, even if it's a domestic company, or it's an item that could be compromised along the way. And so you need to know that chip or whatever is coming from a trusted supplier. The same thing actually somewhat comes in place with trusted capital and knowing that the investors and the people you're playing with are worthwhile. So that has been a part of it. Now, these are relatively complicated supply chains, and there's risks involved when you go to the overseas. So there's certain things that can be done with regard to promote domestic mining or refining capabilities. As the 45X tax credit was used, it's not available for mining, but if you are trying to get after the rare earth metal issue, that would be one of the uses on it. When we talk to our membership, one of the things they bring up is in the last 3 years, 28% lost a critical supplier, 30% lost a sole source supplier. So mapping is not just, it has multiple values: security, understanding, and then recognizing your vulnerabilities and your choke points so you can start to build resilience.
Yeah, as a business owner, one of the things you always look at is your single point of failures. Obviously, one of those key and critical areas is the 92% of microchips and semiconductor capabilities that's within Taiwan. That is why building up Indo-PACOM's capabilities, ensuring that we diffuse some of the increased adversarial kind of nature of both ourselves and China, knowing they're the greater aggressor, looking at ways of coastal defense and other things like that should these things take, but also working with other committees such as Ways and Means with Chairman Smith to eliminate the double taxation on Taiwan, which would allow them to invest in the industrial base here in America to ensure that we have the ability to go forward and create those semiconductors and microchips ourselves. You know, one of the key things that I've been concerned with for a very long time is that America still adopts the idea that warfare is built on kinetic only. The supply chain, the resource capability, the electronic, the IO, IW space, that is really a concern for me as we advance to what real warfare looks like. I mean, if you think about China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea's geopolitical alignment, this is not meant to just involve themselves in a kinetic element, yet proxies from the Iranians will actually help to be a distraction, as we saw with the Houthis, who's disrupted 12% of global trade through the Red Sea when the last administration delisted them as a terrorist organization. But China's aggression has been mostly not just expanding out the Belt and Road Initiative, but utilizing Russia to expand the European, Eastern Front, taking Oceania, taking the 15 of 16 rare earth mineral mines in Africa, and doing what we claim to do on paper, which is, oh, we're sanctioning you. They're doing it from a geopolitical stance where they're actually moving the football by cutting off Western Hemisphere supply chain to the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Black Sea, the Horn of Africa, while using economic coercion on Panama and Honduras to try and influence trade, tariff, taxation, and capabilities through the canal. That's really actually cutting off America and our supply chain capabilities. You know, the thing that's worried me is that we have to get proper procurement reform in place. The DSP 83, DSP 5s that are sometimes held up for political purposes that is not restricted by USML 151 or things like this, are not meeting the 90-day threshold of the Directorate Defense Trade Controls, is putting us really far behind our adversaries with supplying our allies the necessary tools. But I'm committed to continue to support the industrial base to have American-built components, American-built products that allows our economy to thrive and stop adversarial reliance, which allows us to build the economics of another nation who's out to destroy us. Thank you for your support. Thank you for all you guys do. And we're here to give our best to try and make sure America continues to build back strong. With that, I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Does the gentleman from North Carolina have any questions? Yeah, recognize the gentleman from North Carolina.
Well, let me say, as our military faces increasingly challenges with budgetary constraints, prioritizing our defense industrial base is of even greater significance. So with that, thank you all for being here today. Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia employs North Carolinians over the state border in my congressional district in North Carolina's first in the northeastern portion of the state, and is currently hiring North Carolinians, the shipyard. This is my question, Mr. Paxton. What efforts are being done when we talk about taking advantage of entire populations, in particular workforce, all the conversations around workforce? What efforts are being taken to strategically and be intentional about bringing in rural areas in particular in these workforce conversations, and then not just rural areas, but for instance, in North Carolina, we're right there, and many are going into Virginia to then entice states to collaborate more with each other.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. First of all, I think the goodness of the shipbuilding industry and ship repair industry is oftentimes they're the economic engine of some communities that aren't in major city locations. And so the initiatives that I know Newport News and other shipyards do through their apprenticeship programs are world-class, and they attract the best of the best, and they want to hire up those people who maybe didn't go to college, who just got their high school degree and want to have a career. One of the great things about the shipyard industry is you can have that career. And I know Newport News does an exceptional job bringing in the next talent in our shipyard industrial base.
Yeah. Is there anything specific that you would suggest as a priority that would focus specifically in helping to cultivate workforce in rural communities across America?
You know, Congressman, to the extent that we are trying to raise the awareness of the shipyard industrial base, that we are a great family wage career destination, and you've seen some of that with the shipyard industrial base promotions and where those promotions go. So I do think there's outreach to rural areas to make them aware of our industrial base, and that again, these are career jobs.
It was interesting this week. We had educators that came into the office from Chowan County. We had a principal from Chowan Middle School. We also had the STEM coordinator. My question is, could you just speak briefly when we talk about cultivating workforce? Because they were sharing with me their vision of extending STEM, within schools, within the county. How important is STEM?
STEM, and I'm sure my colleagues will have some opinions on this as well. It's absolutely the most critical thing we need right now. And what our shipyards are going into elementary schools now to talk about STEM and talk about careers in the shipyard industry, but I'll hand it off.
Yeah, I think what you want to do is you want to give individuals exposure to the industry so they can develop a passion for it. Many people, they get because one of their parents worked in a field. But if your parents aren't involved in these, if you are at a school where you have the exposure to work, either electrical, plumbing, I mean, there's a range of technical trade skills, and there's a range of STEM topics that people start to develop an interest for when they're young. And then that passion, they discover there's an whole career field attached with that allows you to work with those skills in that areas. And so I think the ability of introducing that, and we have chapters of NDI all around who work with local schools, do different programs in order to expose them to the range of career fields that are out there. And then from that, they look around and they say, oh, there's a shipyard nearby, or I can drive this distance to get there. But trying to show them these are fun, interesting things to do, that there are entire careers behind that you can make a living doing.
And let me say this, North Carolina's first congressional district, we're one of the most economically distressed. And we have to look at these areas that are experiencing distress, and especially rural communities, and really begin to go to the core, and that's building the future through our workforce.
Right.
Thank you so much. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for your time, sharing your expertise. Strengthening the defense industrial base is such a critical issue, especially to my neighbors in central and northwestern Illinois. I'm so glad that we're taking the time to delve into that today. Our defense industrial base fosters innovation, it creates jobs, it helps our allies around the world, and keeps our adversaries at bay. I'm so proud that my district is home to the historic Rock Island Arsenal. That back in the 1830s, there were decisions that were made here in Washington to put one of our most strategic places on an island in the Mississippi River. And still to this day, men and women back home go there to do this important work. And it is my job to make sure that we're making sure that the arsenal will meet the needs into the future. So we know back home firsthand how important the organic industrial base is. So Mr. Fanning, I'll begin with you. Has the Department of Defense, in your opinion, done a good enough job leveraging the organic industrial base in areas where the private sector is not there?
I think the department does do a good job, prodded by Congress to make sure that they do that. Where I think perhaps there's a problem is the investment in that organic industrial base and the arsenals. I think much like surge capacity is generally a bill payer in the end. Most installation investments, I think, are a bill payer in the end. But I do think the department does a good job, again, because they know Congress is watching at leveraging that organic industrial base.
Thank you. The Rock Island Arsenal is also home to the Army's Center for Excellence for Advanced and Additive Manufacturing, which has pushed the boundaries of innovation through the surrounding defense industry all around eastern Iowa and western Illinois, where I represent. The story of advanced and additive manufacturing at Rock Island, it shows how investing in our modernization improves the readiness and strengthens our national security posture. So, Mr. Norquist, to what extent do you see additive manufacturing playing a role in the future of the defense industrial base?
So I see two particular areas that I'll focus on. There are many, but let me just dwell on two. One of them is in places that do maintenance, repair, and others. The ability to get an old piece of equipment working by additive manufacturing saves you. The other part is when you have either deployed or at home a spare part you don't have access to. Deployed, it may be because of a supply disruption. At home, it may be because it's an old item and the vendor went out of business. The ability of additive manufacturing to say, we can produce that for you without the traditional cost of tooling and running a production line and then doing a run of 20, right, which is incredibly inefficient, provides real opportunities for the department in terms of rationalizing its supply, its parts, and its production. So I think there's a lot of great opportunity, and I think this is one of those areas we've seen progress and succeed as it's moved into new and different fields.
And how important is that, especially as this administration seems to go at cost-cutting measures and efficiency? How important is that?
Oh, it's a major cost savings. So I think about it, think of all the systems we have that were built 20, 30 years ago. Many of those suppliers are gone. So the cost of trying to build those the traditional way is both financially expensive, but operationally such a long lead time. Additive manufacturing says, we can do that faster and less and let you keep things up and running. So I really see that as one of the key items for speed and cost savings in the department.
Right. Glad that we could be a part of that in my district. And also the Congresswoman across the aisle, Congresswoman Kiggins, she had asked about, the effect that it has on this when we look at short-term CRs. And I know she had asked that to you, Mr. Fanning. Mr. Norquist or Mr. Paxton, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, the one thing I would add is in ship repair, if we go much longer, we're going to be talking about work stoppages. And no one wants that. We don't want to issue warn notices. We don't want to do that. So that's the severity of the CR. It's going to be hard on the shipyard industrial base.
Yeah. Mr. Norquist?
On the CRs, I think one of the things that people tend to misunderstand on CRs is a regular appropriation bill can have the top line go up or down. The only thing that's different is a CR tells you, don't do the stuff you think you need to do next. Do the stuff you used to do a year ago, even if it was something you recommended stopping. It's incredibly inefficient, and then it creates cascading effects down through the system. One is, instead of awarding a single contract, the contractor is doing multiple iterations, which creates instability and uncertainty. And then the other part is funds just aren't aligned in the right place. Right. And so we have had companies get stop work orders because they were under CR and the government didn't know how much O&M they'd have, how much maintenance money. So they said, and that company just laid off its workforce. And then 2 months later, they said, hey, we think we're in a better shape. Can you find them again? And so they'd try and find them from wherever they were and bring them back. But unnecessary. It's just you're putting on the brakes, and then at year end, you're going to hit the accelerator, right? And then you're going to pay the consequences. It's incredibly inefficient.
Yeah. Thank you to all three of you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I recognize the gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for appearing before us today. Mr. Paxton, I'm going to be directing my questions at you. Would you concur, good sir, that small shipyards are an important part of the industrial base that our nation requires as we look at the future of shipbuilding and our responsibility to provide vessels for the United States Navy?
Absolutely, sir.
Okay. So workforce availability is challenging across the spectrum of shipbuilding in America. Is that an accurate statement, generally speaking?
Our number one challenge, sir.
Number one challenge. There you go. So if smaller shipyards for our republic, and by extension, may I say, not only in defense of the United States of America, but for the prosperity and security of the entire world, it relies upon the United States Navy. And we agree that small shipyards are a vital and significant part of any foreseeable shipbuilding future for the United States of America and should be recognized as such. So workforce stoppage, when you pause a job, the impact of that for a smaller shipyard is far greater than on your larger shipyards. They just move those guys. They can keep their welders, their fitters, their machinists, their supervisors, et cetera. They can shift them, to another project within that larger shipyard. But a smaller shipyard can't do that. They have to bear the cost of even a shutdown for a few weeks can mean that they have to let these guys go. And then that workforce leaves, and these welders and fitters and machinists, they're going to get other jobs. And it's difficult to replace that workforce for your smaller shipyards. So how would you address that? And I yield to the gentleman. Is the Pentagon paying attention? Is the cornerstone question here.
I think, Congressman, you raise a very important point. We should be opening the aperture in DoD contracts for smaller shipyards that can do some of the work the Navy needs to get done. For instance, a shipyard in your state got a contract to build berthing barges. It should not have been a complex contract, and it became very complex for that shipyard. And we should
talking about the YRBM and Conrad?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
But what we're trying to achieve there, sir, is open that aperture for a shipyard like that cuts its teeth on commercial work and makes, does really great things, employs a lot of people. They shouldn't have been punished for getting a government contract.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So you concur that this consideration is part of the totality of circumstance that the DoD, the Pentagon, that our Navy commanders and the executive branch must keep in mind when we're laying out plans for what the shipbuilding looks like in America and how we're going to actually perform. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to unanimous consent to submit for the record a letter that I submitted to the executive branch on February 24th regarding this topic, the importance of workforce and the impact of shutting down programs, even temporarily. I'd like unanimous consent to enter to the record, please, sir.
Hearing no objection.
Thank you. Mr. Paxton, I have one specific question I'd like to get to. Your testimony cites excessive oversight and frequent design changes by the Navy as causing delays. And I'm saying that those delays may be manageable by your larger shipyards, but they can cause significant economic injury to our smaller shipyards, and I yield to the gentleman to respond to that position.
Yes, sir. I think we should be clear-eyed about once we have a functional baseline design on that ship, we have to be rigid in not having requirements creep and ship specifications continually to increase, because that drives up costs, that drives down the schedule, and it ultimately hurts smaller shipyards.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, thank you for convening this hearing, and my time has expired. I yield.
Thank you. Recognize Mr. Vinman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question is for Mr. Fanning. Sir, you served as a secretary when I worked in the headquarters at the Pentagon, and so you are very familiar with the Pentagon and the Army bureaucracy. And you stated in your testimony that the defense industrial base is largely shaped by a single customer, the federal government, that the defense industrial base relies on federal investment to ensure the overall health of the industry. And I agree that it's critical that we support our defense industrial base in a way that supports new technology at reasonable cost and delivery timeline, especially in response to the prevalence of weapons such as cheap and easily acquirable drones. So I've been thinking about the modern battlefield and what we see developing in Ukraine. These small, inexpensive systems that have really been a game changer. The Ukrainians are looking at establishing basically a 15-kilometer kill zone that's largely unmanned. How do we maintain the speed of innovation, smarter, faster development of systems when we have a acquisition system that is antiquated, that it takes years to develop? Give you a chance to answer that first.
Sure, thanks.
Simple question.
Well, I think what we're learning in Ukraine is you need high-end and low-end that you can buy in volume is attributable. And what's interesting about that part of your production plan, of your acquisition plan, is that there's the opportunity for a lot of competition there. You're not going to have a lot of competition in legacy platforms that you keep that are fairly mature and way too expensive for some new company to come in and try and compete. But you can get a lot of competition here to bring new entrants into the industrial base. I think the issue on the acquisition side, David and I served on the PPE Reform Commission. There's some great ideas in there, I would say. And one is a way to, how do you create some more competition and speed inside the department? One is portfolio management. Give the program managers, the PEOs, the ability to think of pots of money differently and move things around inside of them. It requires a lot more transparency with Congress so you can complete your oversight responsibilities. But you can try to reform the entire acquisition program, or you can take the parts where you really need that speed the most and focus on those. And I think it's some of this new technology that we're seeing coming in.
And there's some decent models out there for special operations authorities that can move much faster than the typical system. Do you see any major issue with actually just applying or dropping that model in that special operations forces use to regular acquisitions?
I think, what I would argue is it's the risk rheostat's been turned too far in the anti-risk direction, and I would, if someone wants to take a risk, I'd applaud it so long as there's transparency and it can be monitored. What's nice about the special operations authorities is they've been tested over a long period of time, and so we have some confidence in them. The question I'd be is just be careful which ones can scale and which ones can't scale. There's lots of rapid authorities and rapid offices in the Department of Defense that are designed as workarounds that wouldn't scale very well. But I think what Special Operations has done has proven to be a good model, and I think you could apply it to other things very quickly.
Thank you for that. And so I think getting the right balance between the exquisite, expensive systems and the cheap, dual-use systems is going to be critically important. So, Mr. Norquist, without giving you too much of a preamble, because I only have less than a minute left, you know, production of the magazine, so to speak, that we need, artillery, missiles, and such, is way behind where we are producing right now. So, as the U.S. doubled its production capacity, we're still struggling to produce artillery shells, for example. So how do we address that issue?
So I think there's a couple of things. The first is to recognize part of the way we got here was the wild swings in munitions. So I think one of the first steps is working with the department to have much clearer floors for munitions inventory. That way, the vendor understands there's going to be a quantity. The department warfighters know that in the event of a conflict, they will have access to greater volume. There are things you can do with the vendor in terms of helping them set up new facilities and being able to addition production, but that assumes that the demand signal is going to be long enough. It takes several years to get a factory up and running, and sometimes with these, the signal is actually going to drop on the other side, and that creates a problem.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I recognize the gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fanning, in your written testimony, you touched on how rapid inflation caused by the Biden administration weakened the defense industrial base. And I just yesterday met with Excelio, which is in my district, about that very thing. Talked about the inflation crisis and how it was especially harmful for the small businesses in the industrial base. You know, these mom and pop shops effectively had their fixed price contracts renegotiated to slash their revenue by 20% through no fault of their own. And for many companies, this means laying off staff or closing their doors. What flexibility does the DoD have to support small contractors during extreme situations like the inflation crisis that we've had, and how can Congress assist them?
Well, first, I think recognizing the impact of inflation, my observation in this job, having been in government before, is that industry is the shock absorber of inflation. The Pentagon seemed to think that it had managed through inflation because it hadn't hit it yet. When the next round of contracts or economic order quantities or competitions take place, that inflation that has been absorbed by industry is going to show up, and the government's going to have to deal with it. And I think the way that what government can do in real time, which is hard, is pay for it. The contracts, most of the contracts that are directly with the government have adjustment clauses in them. But it doesn't matter if there's no money to pay for those adjustment clauses. And that's what caused, you know, the primes, anyone who has a direct contract with the government to absorb it and then pass it down through the supply chain. And what you're seeing now is small businesses that are locked into contracts to their customer pre-inflation, but are now buying materials and parts in post-inflation, and their margins are just getting squeezed.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, and we can chase them out of the defense industrial base because they can adjust to inflation much more quickly on the non-defense side of the work that they're doing.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Mr. Norquist, in your written testimony, you talk about the burden of regulatory compliance that contractors are forced to bear in order to support our national defense. For small contractors who can't afford to devote an entire position or a department to compliance, the regulatory burden is crippling. Do you have any sort of estimates as to how much time or money the average small contractor is forced to commit in order to meet federal requirements? And you know, it seemed to me like Congress would want those resources to be focused on supporting the warfighter instead of checking the box for DoD.
So we don't have estimates in the aggregate, but individual things like the CMMC standard, how many, you know, 100,000, 200,000 are they going to have to spend to get, or just for the annual inspections? Each of those we tend to, you know, for some of them we will have estimates. But as you point out, Those are all significant burdens for the small business, and it makes moving into the barrier to moving into the government sector or staying there very high.
Well, and it also takes money away from the warfighter, right? When they're
Correct.
spending it on compliance instead of, right?
Right.
Okay, thank you. I would yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I recognize the gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Ranking Member, Mr. Fanning, Mr. Norquist, and Mr. Paxton. Thank you for being here today. Mr. Norquist, I want to start with a question for you. I think you mentioned or identified brittle supply chains as one of the key vulnerabilities facing America's defense industrial base. Often our defense critical supply chains can be dependent on products and materials sourced from other strategic competitors and adversaries, including China. And my district in the St. Louis region is home to numerous contractors and subcontractors that are part of the crucial backbone of our nation's defense, including the aerospace industry. Given recent efforts to increase our leverage and involvement of small and medium-sized defense contractors, what steps are you aware of that the Department of Defense is taking to ensure these entities have the necessary support and resources to meet the demands of our national defense strategy?
So I think you bring up a critical challenge, which is mapping the supply chain, understanding where you are either vulnerable because it's offsides or you're vulnerable because of the fragility of your supply chain. I know the department has been looking at different choke points. Solid rocket motors is one of the most obvious ones where there was not a capacity to meet it, but they have, and I think some of it may be covered in their National Defense Industrial Strategy, where they go through and they work backwards and say, where are the common choke points? And that's a common project you often do with industry to map, to understand where the overlaps are. Sometimes competitors who are bidding against each other and build different products are actually buying from the same supplier for the part. And so being able to be aware that that part disruption there would affect several. Then the question goes to the government about what's the best way to deal with it. You know, one of the old techniques is Defense Production Act. You go to the supplier and you help them increase their capacity. That works well. The other ones is in future contracts, you incentivize the winning firm to develop a second supplier as part of their contract. And so they will then grow a second subcontractor who will be able to provide that. Both of those are useful, and I think it's really a matter of understanding where the choke points are versus what you don't want to do is do that where you actually already have capacity and there are other firms willing to bid, and if you just found them, they'd come right on in.
Thank you. And Mr. Fanning, as industry continues to drive innovation in military and civilian aviation, how do you see Missouri-based contractors contributing to the development of next-generation technologies?
Well, I think our industry has a footprint in every state in the country, and so
which is great, but
I know you're talking about Missouri. I think which is fantastic. We Missouri specific, I'd have to get back to you on that, and we can have a conversation because, as we said earlier, workforce is the critical component here. There's shortages, and if there are regions or states in the countries that want to work with aerospace and defense, that's an easy partnership to develop.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Fanning. Mr. Norquist, I want to continue the discussion on supply chain resilience and security. While it's essential to reduce reliance on parts and products from strategic competitors, it's also critical to strengthen cooperation and expand industrial supply chains with our allies. Can you speak to the importance of fostering robust partnerships and trade within the industrial base, particularly with our NATO allies and other multilateral security partners? Are there any specific programs or initiatives that you believe are particularly effective in this regard?
So I think one of the things that people need to understand is with our formal allies, we have over 50% of the world's GDP. So there's amount of economic capability there These countries are both suppliers of parts to us, and if they're allies, then they're friendly suppliers, as well as buyers of the products we make, which create jobs here. So there's a value in having that working relationship with them. There has been work in AUKUS with UK and Australia to be able to expand our ability to do that trade. There are certain companies in Europe that are absolutely essential for certain systems that we build where they're the best supplier. So I think it behooves us to take advantage of allies when they are useful, and it's useful to be able to have allies take advantage of and buy from the U.S., and I think that reciprocity is part of what makes it effective.
The gentleman's time has expired.
I think that's my time. I yield back.
Thank you. Recognize Mr. Cisneros.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Norquist, good to see you again. You know, as a former comptroller, former deputy secretary of defense, I think you're well aware of the cause of what a continuing resolution and how it impacts, you know, defense building and the industrial base. But I'm actually going to ask you about the workforce. So would you say developing the workforce given production shortfalls is a priority? You know, companies like in your association continue to invest in higher education and engineering degrees, but we still need manual labor, the wrench turners, the guys who actually build the things. We need that to create we need to create the workforce for tomorrow. So what role do your industries have in expanding all of our future workforce, and not just recruiting engineers and STEM degrees, but actually building the guys who are putting hands on the product and building it?
So I think, first of all, it's important to understand the value. You know, people use the expression blue-collar workers, but they're skilled labor. And in many of these skills, they're very complicated skills. An advanced electrician, a welder working on an aluminum inside, those are very complicated processes. And so with industry, what you want to be able to do is recruit people and train them and then retain them, because it's the years of experience in that training. And so I think industry is very keen on that. It understands the risk of disruption. There are things that we can do to help. You know, when there's a break in production, the incentives financially are to get the industry to lay people off. There's not an incentive to try and retain them. That's not in the government's long-term interest. There's opportunities to encourage training of people coming in before they're on board. That can be, if that was an allowable cost, that would encourage it. But I think it's really important as we see how many of these places, the value of that skilled laborers and their ability to produce a quality product is essential to our national security. And often it's the shortage there that's holding back a number of industries.
And that's the thing, right, is how do we get people, I don't think anybody really kind of knows or thinks growing up is like, hey, I want to be a welder, but not only a welder, I want to be a skilled welder in this industry, and don't realize actually what a good career that could be. But how do we work to recruit people into these industries and to become those skilled laborers, to go and to retain them, as you say?
So there was a time when we started to shift and started emphasizing college and a liberal arts degree as a solution for everyone. And we saw that both in things being done in the Department of Education. We saw that even in the military, when people were leaving the military, that was sort of the theme. The answer is, in fact, there's many of these career fields, the skilled labor are much better paying and have much more stability and a more interesting career field. And so I think we need to both inside the department and as a country right-size the recognition of both the value of that labor and making it clear to people the potential to have a real career, that this isn't something you do interim. You can make this a long-term career and be have a very successful life in a very positive environment.
Thank you. Mr. Fanning, I want to ask you around the same lines, really. You know, what are some of the biggest challenges you see in the aerospace and defense industry in attracting and retaining these skilled workers?
I think I'd just be echoing what David said. We pivoted in this country away from vocational and technical training to community college investments. And I think not only did we move the needle too far in the other direction, but David mentioned the value of this work. We sent a message about the value of this work, the worth of this work to our country. And I think we know we have jobs that pay 50% more than the national average. We pay well, we have to pay well, we need that type of a workforce. And so I've got company in Kansas that actually recruits on farms because they can at least find people who work with big equipment. We need to have that pipeline, and it has to start early. That feeds into STEM. That can be this type of high-skilled labor you talked about.
Right.
And what we want to do is hire people in and not just train them, recruit them, but grow them and move them into those higher skilled jobs that are on the floor.
I think this is something we need to look at, right? And I know the Department of Defense, and I'm sure you all know this, right? We got fifth graders going in to get them interested in science and physics and becoming engineers. But I think we need to start getting not only the government, but industry as well, focused on and making investments to have building that skilled labor so that we have that workforce for tomorrow, especially as these weapons get more technical and difficult to build. So anything we can do to partner with industry to kind of make that happen, I am here to help and support that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Recognize Mr. Tran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I am deeply concerned about our dependence on components and materials sourced from the People's Republic of China and the implications of our supply chain. China is already levying new export restrictions against the United States, and I have no expectations that tensions between our two countries will be alleviating anytime soon. The question is, for any of the witnesses, what are the most critical supply chain vulnerabilities in the defense sector, and how can we better mitigate China's influence on U.S. supply chains?
So I'll just start with a few, and they can jump in. I think one of the places you see this is energy storage and batteries and the materials needed to produce those. That has effect across a wide range of technologies, and many of those also depend on rare earth metals for development, either not produced here or not refined here. And so that would be one where you would need to look to both improve your either your stockpiling, your development, your processing, or make mining either here or through an ally. You'll also see this came up with microelectronics, right? And that one is not just a interrupt the supply for the Department of Defense. It's how do I know the integrity of the chips that I am using have not been compromised. So I think those two, I think raw materials we've talked about extensively in this one, and feeds into both of those two questions. So I'd start there as the ones I would highlight.
And I would maybe expand the focus a little bit to adversary capital, watching very carefully where China is moving its manufacturing to make sure that we're not getting it through a secondary source. And then a recognition, this is decades-long whipsaws. It was our strategic focus to partner closely with China over time. And so some of these things will take time if they're left on their own to right themselves. So there's an investment requirement there if we want to get speed.
Thank you. Mr. Pat.
Yeah, my comment here would just be where we are down to single source suppliers in our shipyard industrial base supply chain. We have got to make sure the health of the industrial base is such that, when we continue to ramp up, and that signal might be coming that we're going to do that we have a supply chain that can be resilient and answer that call.
Thank you. You'll hear me talk a lot about our people. After all, our people are the military's greatest asset. In this case, I would like to know more about recruiting and retaining the skilled workers needed to meet production demands. What are the key workforce shortages affecting the defense industrial base? And what specific partnership will be necessary to ensure industry can identify and recruit enough talent to meet our strategic requirements? I know we talked a little bit with Rep. Cisneros, but specific partnerships is what I'm looking for. Any of the gentlemen?
So I'll just start. The key ones are skilled labor, STEM, and also people who can get clearances, because that becomes a choke point as well. Some of the most important partnerships are with the local communities through their high schools and other programs, so that employees get exposed, students get exposed to the technologies, the STEM, the trade skills, and that creates a pipeline, as well as them being aware of what industry opportunities are available in the area. So I think those are some of the starting points. I think the Navy has done a good job of this. I think the Air Force is looking at doing this as well, to be able to bring people in and let them know that this exists, right? There's an opportunity here. So I'll pause there and let the others weigh in, but that's where I'd start.
I think absolutely local communities and educational institutions and expanding so that the educational systems and the state and local governments can see what will help these students get jobs like this. And it backs up further than high school. I mean, if you want to do some of these jobs, you have to start taking and understanding and studying math in elementary school. And so that's a long pipeline that's important. But I would say the importance of retaining, because you brought that up as well. And one of the hardest things that undercuts retention is inconsistency, surging, and coming down off of a surge. And you know, we've talked about it in terms of demand signal and investment, but these companies never want to lose their workers. They'll go someplace else, and it'll be very hard to get them back. And we saw that in COVID. Again, the shared supply chain, it hit the commercial aviation side so hard, and that was the focus. How do we keep those workers? Because we won't get them back. They're in demand, they'll go someplace else. And so that consistency that industry can have so they can plan around retaining that workforce is very important.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I yield back. Thank you. And the chair would wants to announce we will have a hard stop at 1 o'clock. And with that, I recognize Ms. Helfrith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Fully recognizing I'm bad in cleanup, so I just have one question for everybody, and it's kind of a natural evolution of some of the questions that we just heard, but appreciating there are multiple variables that contribute to what we're discussing today. Obviously, workforce that we've discussed, supply chain issues, continuing resolutions aren't helping any of this, but I'd like to specifically drill down on the threat of this administration's tariffs on our allies and our adversaries, both on the raw materials that you utilize from copper and aluminum to lumber, but also a lot of the process materials and the products that we've also discussed today. So I just want to have a greater appreciation from any of the witnesses as to the potential impact the tariffs that have been announced could have on exacerbating this challenge.
Aerospace and defense is the largest net exporting manufacturing industry in the country, and we've had the longest running export surplus of any industry in the country. So our market's all over the world, and a part of that is also having a supply chain that's all over the world. And we have been doing a lot of work to rationalize that supply chain, get it out of China, take the lessons we learned from COVID and move it where we needed to, follow successive administrations' guidance on this. But buying American, it involves getting a part of the economic benefit of that purchase. Companies that buy airplanes, for example, they also want some economic benefit from doing that. And so there are incentives to buy American, to invest and to move your supply chain internationally. So we're watching this very closely. When we went through this before, the defense industry in particular was given very careful consideration for exemptions, recognizing that any tariffs that are impacting what the government is buying essentially go back to the taxpayer because of the economic adjustments that are in the contracts.
So I think there are multiple ways the government gets revenue. Each one of them has an effect on how it takes it and the incentives it creates. And so I think with a tariff, you'd have to figure out what is it on and what products, and then you have to work through the supply chain to figure out what's disrupted. And remember the second order effect, which I may not be buying from overseas. I may be buying from a U.S. supplier who's, right. So there are consequences to that. And as everyone, trying to understand the effect on defense and making sure that those are taken into account so you don't harm national security would be an essential step.
I'll just say as a general matter, on the commercial side of things, it's much because we have global supply chains on commercial shipbuilding. There are some real near-term impacts on what that could mean cost-wise, but like my two colleagues have said, there's still a lot of kind of analysis of what's going on here and what we're going to get.
Thank you very much. And I think it's clear that there are, again, multiple variables here, but adding an additional stressor the effects are still unclear as to our preparedness, our readiness, all of those things. And so I do hope this committee continues to ask these questions and have these challenging conversations. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you. And we recognize that the chair recognizes Mr. Scott from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. I'm sorry that I've been running in and out of other meetings with people from the Department of Defense. not taking care of the supply chain just a few years ago put our country in a position where if we wanted to launch a rocket, we actually had to buy that rocket from Russia, if I'm not mistaken. Correct? And I think that obviously, if we had not gotten ourselves out of that position, we would be in dire straits right now. And I'm afraid maybe that we haven't necessarily learned our lessons. Certainly, Buy American makes sense. And a lot of things, Mr. Paxton, and I'm going to come back to you, Mr. Manning. One of the areas that I have the hardest time with, though, I understand the shipbuilders need a consistent flow to get decent pricing for us and reasonable margins for them. But I don't understand why we only buy one ship or one part of a ship at the time. I don't understand why we don't do block purchases. And the thing that I have the hardest time with, though, with the shipbuilding is like just buying roll-on, roll-off containers for Transcom. I would prefer to have the U.S. shipbuilding industry focus on more specialized products when we could buy roll-on, roll-offs from Singapore or South Korea. But why are we only contracting for one ship at the time? Why does it cost so much more in America?
Well, certainly we are subject to the appropriation process where these ships are bought in a single appropriation year. But certainly we have advocated for block buys. The recent amphib bundle down at Ingalls was exactly the right thing to do. Putting ships together in groups like that gives the shipyard everything they need for predictability and sustainability. The other thing I'd say, this committee authorized a 10-ship buy of Conroes, Ro-Ros for the National Defense Reserve Fleet, and that was very smart. Appropriations were funded for that, and we still had the Maritime Administration sitting on putting that out to contract. And in that case, Congressman, we would be using commercial best practices to build those ships.
Oh, okay, but it is cheaper to buy the roll-on, roll-offs from.
Congressman, I think the reality is when we buy in 1s and 2s and 3s here, it's more expensive. If you buy an order of 10, it's going to be much more affordable. Yeah. I will say, okay. If you're buying in orders of 70 and 100.
Thank you. Yep. We got to work through this.
Yes, sir.
We can't pay as much as we are for the equipment we need, and it can't take this long. Secretary Fanning, I'm going to come to you because you were Air Force before you were Army, right?
Yes. Navy before that.
Okay. Well, I was trying to give you credit without demerits. The data on the F-35, we listened yesterday. I'm very concerned about the contracting. When the United States taxpayer pays for the development of a weapon system, and then we turn around and because of poor lawyer contracting, we end up not owning data or systems that we've paid for. Do we own the data on the F-35?
Congressman, I actually don't know the answer to that question. We don't work on individual programs at AI. We're
okay. I thought maybe from your time as Air Force.
I don't recall specifically. I do know that data rights is a complex issue, and it does come down to what's in the contract. But I don't know the answer to your specific question.
So as a guy from the private sector, I don't think it's that complex in the private sector. If a private company pays to develop something, they own what they paid to develop. And so I want our defense contractors to be successful, and being successful means you have a reasonable margin, just as being responsible to the taxpayers. When the U.S. taxpayers' funds are used to develop a system, the U.S. taxpayers should not have to pay to license that system back. And that's something that the U.S. government has got to do a better job of. I appreciate all of you. Sorry that I've been running from meeting to meeting, and sorry, Mr. Norquist, I could have asked you a trigonometry question or something. But thank you.
The chair recognizes Mr. Khanna.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Paxton, I found your testimony very, very helpful and on point, especially as you pointed out that our shipbuilders are competing with state-owned enterprises, that it's not a fair competition. I mean, China, South Korea, Japan basically have been financing their ship industry for decades, and we have not done that with our ship industry. Now, others have pointed out that China is making 1,700 ships a year in the commercial sector, and we're making about 5. I'm a co-sponsor on Mr. Garamendi's excellent CHIPS bill, which is bipartisan. But my understanding is that would take us from making 5 ships to 25 ships a year, 250 ships in 10 years. I mean, we're still orders of magnitude less than China. And I guess my question is, you know, the bill, as I understand it, is about $250 million of investment a year. But if we're serious about this, shouldn't we be putting in more money and financing a shipbuilding industry in this country like we did in World War II with Roosevelt, and actually making the investment that is required to catch up, if we can, to China, or at least have some capacity?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, for the question. I don't think we're ever going to catch up to China. I think what we want to try to achieve, and I think what the SHIPS Act is trying to achieve, is having that national maritime strategy, a 250 commercial strategic fleet that balances out the fact that we don't have any logistics globally in the maritime space beyond the Maritime Security Program, which is about 65 ships. So I think this legislation gets us down the path, sir. And I think the legislation thinks about stuff like the cost differential subsidy, which we let go in 1981. And is that something that we're serious about implementing again? And if we are, what's that demand side of the signal for what these ships are going to go and do? I think it's undeniable, though, the Ready Reserve fleet is aging out. We need to recapitalize our auxiliaries. We should be building 2 auxiliaries a year in perpetuity. And I think the SHIPS Act gets at that logistical lack of logistics that we have.
Mr. President, how much can the federal financing solve this? I mean, with generous investment tax credits and generous financing. I understand there's need for regulatory reform, and I get your point.
Yes.
You don't want, 1 inspector for 2 ship workers. Fine. But that's. I'm not saying that's the easy part, but let's say we have a consensus on that. If Congress said tomorrow we're going to put $1 billion into this, or more money, will that solve it? I mean, is that really the biggest variable?
I don't think it's just money is the variable. I think what you've been hearing a lot today is that demand signal. Are we serious about this, or is this going to be a 5-year initiative that then goes away? I think if we were serious about this and you could see out on a horizon of 10 to 15 to 20 years, absolutely this industry is so capable that they will invest in their facilities and continue to grow and can be serious about building.
And would the government have to give the demand signal even for the commercial fleet, or would it be a purchase tax credit for American consumers or American businesses who used American fleets?
Yeah, I think there has to be a demand side to this. I think the Energizing American Shipbuilding Act, which looks at prioritizing a certain amount of our petroleum and LNG to go on preferenced U.S.-built LNG carriers or U.S.-built tankers, is how you get at this. And so I think you got to have a demand side of it, of what we're going to do with these ships.
Well, I appreciate it. I really appreciated your testimony and look forward to working in a bipartisan way to
Thank you,
support
Congressman.
shipbuilding.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Chair recognizes Mr. Van Orden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Paxton, I chair a subcommittee on the Veterans Affairs Committee. It's great, economic opportunity. And I've learned something. I've been in Congress for 2 years and 5 minutes. This is what I figured out. An agency, a department, or an office is not a person. And the only way to get stuff done is to identify the person and then, unfortunately, sometimes humiliate them on public television. And that's not my intent with you, sir. So I guess that was a little sketchy there for a sec, wasn't it? So who by name, is the person that is responsible for setting out these standards that are so exquisite for these ships that we're physically incapable of building them? Who is that?
First of all, Congressman, great question. We work with our Navy partners, private industry does, and we really do have a relationship where we want to get better. There is a lot of
Mr. Paxton?
Yes.
That's not a person, is it?
Yeah, that's not a person. We work very closely with NAVC, and a lot of the folks at NAVC work on some of these.
Will you do me a favor?
Yes, sir.
I want to talk to you. We can do it in private if you want. But I want to find the person, and I want to figure out why they're setting these standards that are ludicrously high. Are you familiar with Liberty ships?
Yes, sir, I am.
Okay, so the Liberty ship, we realized we didn't have enough maritime transport during World War II, so they developed a thing called a Liberty ship. Unfortunately, they had some issues with the welding, and they broke in half. You know what I'm talking about? Like they get torpedoed and they break in half because they didn't do the welding job. Anyway, they fixed that. And then we were producing a ship a day. The United States of America was producing a ship a day, and then was it Himmler figured that out? Or no, Goering figured that out, and he's like, we have just lost the war. So Nazi Germany realized they lost the war when we could produce a ship a day. And those Liberty ships are very simple. So maybe we need to get back to that basic concept. Mr. Fanning, how you doing, man?
Well, thank you.
You have repeatedly stated that these continuing resolutions are not helpful, and it is having a detrimental effect on national security. Is that correct?
It is.
Okay. So could we maybe think that some of the folks in my party and in my other party, or the other party here, could be cloaking themselves behind patriotism and fiscal conservatism, and they're actually having a detrimental effect on our budget and the security of the United States? Would you say that's an accurate statement?
I'll say that I agree. CRs are detrimental to our nation's security in the industrial base, yes.
Okay, well then I'll just say it. There's some people in my party and the guys across the aisle who are cloaking themselves in patriotism and fiscal conservatism, and they're actually making us spend more money and making the world and our nation less safe for political purposes. And that's got to stop. But national security should never be political. And our budget, believe it or not, should not be political either. So when we do have some folks that are complaining about this Doge thing, which I'm a very strong supporter of, they don't understand that a smaller, more nimble force is more accurate and more lethal. And so I think there's room for both sides to come together and put the American flag over their political T-shirt.
The top line is a separate issue. This is about operating as efficiently and effectively as possible with what you spend.
Correct.
And it's an enormously complex industrial base, making simple things up to enormously complex things that nobody else in the world can make. And the fits and starts of how it's funded and what's allowed is extremely costly and costs time.
Mr. Fanning, would you say that even if we had the manufacturing capacity to produce everything that we possibly wanted, that we still wouldn't be able to get it to the troops because our acquisition process simply sucks? That's a term of art. I learned it in law school.
If we had the resources to build everything we wanted, yes, we would still be getting things to the troops late.
Okay.
It's not just a question of resource. In fact, resource is probably covering up some of the problems in the system.
Would you say it's an issue of process, not product?
Yeah, I would. I mean, we are building the most complicated things. You know, we've been talking quantities of ships and those types of things, but nobody can match the effect of what we build. And so I do think it's a process issue. It's an investment issue. It's a political issue. It's a process issue.
Gotcha.
But we're not unleashing the full strength of our industrial base.
Thank you, Mr. Fanning. My time has expired, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Fallon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be brief. I know we had a hard stop at 1, so I want to thank all the witnesses for coming, and thank you for your great line of questioning. I like your industry terms. Mr. Fanning, how can the procurement process in the defense industrial base become more agile and enhance adaptability and cost efficiency?
In the industrial base or in the
defense industrial base?
In the defense, well, I think the defense industrial base will respond to whatever process the customer puts in place. It's not like, I liken it to, it's a simple analogy, a hardware store. You know, there's only one customer buying hammers, and if you stop buying hammers, or if you want to buy hammers in a different way or different color, the hardware store is going to respond to that. So I think the change has to come from the Department of Defense, and the processes are there, and industry will fold around that, and whoever figures it out the best is going to be the one that wins. And if we emphasize speed, nimbleness, and the metric of getting something to the troops, the companies that do that will win.
And then if I could ask the three witnesses just to touch on this. I just came from the DOGE subcommittee. So I was doging. I think that's the first time I used that as a verb. But, you know, how do you all think the DoD can reform the acquisitions process to accelerate innovation, to deploy critical technologies, and really, honestly, just become far more efficient and give the taxpayers more bang for the buck? If you want to start with Mr. Paxton and go to your right, that'd be great. Thank you.
Well, if we're going to look at acquisition reform, which I think we should do, I think this committee's all about that, and we have some proposals, both the House and the Senate. We really have got to get serious about the level of oversight, the volume of our contracts. You know, when we're building something relatively simple, we're still dealing with 4,000 to 5,000 page contracts. I don't know if that's efficient. I do know that's not efficient. We should be streamlining our acquisition and contracting process extensively.
Mr. Norquist.
So one of the things I'd point out is, you know, we've had studies on the acquisition, we've had studies on the budget. Where we haven't focused is requirements. One of the challenges is if I write, and this is a tradition of the department, very specific requirements, you are going to have to build to that solution. And as the United States, we have a very innovative population, we have an innovative industrial base. So trying to use central planning and be better communists than the Chinese is not going to get us to the solution we want. The place you get disrupting big savings is when somebody says, I don't need this widget, I have this problem. I need to sink a ship at sea from a distance. I need to, come tell me how you might do this, right? Because otherwise you get very incremental changes, you get cost plus contracts, and the person who comes in with something that cuts the cost in half, well, that's not a very welcome solution. It doesn't generate revenue for you. It doesn't meet the contract. So you want to really open up to disruptive, innovative ideas. And we've seen this is what happens in the private sector. Somebody comes in and finds a way that does something that others do for half the price, and they just do it differently altogether. And then all of a sudden that takes off, other companies enter, and then the price comes down. But we really have to be careful in our requirements process not to handcuff the solution, but to open up where you can. Now, some parts, it's got to be a widget, it's got to fit exactly in here, that's fine. But if you're trying to open up defense, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And let people bring you some very radical solutions.
Great, thank you. Mr. Fanning, you want to bring us home?
I agree, it starts with the requirements. Bring industry in as early as possible, and bring the warfighter in as early as possible, the ones actually going to use it. You know, field things, it gets improved more and faster when you get it into the hands of the warfighter earlier and let them figure out how to make it work. The second is it's not rocket science. It's not easy, though. It is every part of the process needs a review. It's an additive process where things were put in because something wrong happened and you want some mechanism to prevent it. There's no countervailing process to clear the brush of this. And I would give more control. It comes with more oversight to program managers to be able to move money around to who the winners and losers are in coordination with the combatant commanders who are actually fielding the weaponry. But you want, you know, winners and losers as they present themselves, as you bring them in early, you want to be able to reward them quicker.
Mm-hmm. So be practical, fill a need, and live within the bounds of reality. That sounds like you're saying. Thank you very much, and thank you, Chairman. I appreciate it. I yield back.
I thank our witnesses for being here and our members for their participation. The committee stands adjourned.